Welcome back to the channel. Today, we read journeying back to the heart of the Dark Ages to uncover the story of the man who would forge an empire. From the remnants of Rome, Charlemagne. But to understand the emperor, we must first understand the boy. The story of Charles the Great begins not with a grand coronation, but in the shadows of one of history's minor mysteries. Contemporary sources can't quite agree, placing his birth somewhere between 747 and 748 AD. But what we know for sure is that he was born at the absolute peak of Carolingian power. He was born into a dynasty that was already rewriting the map of Western Europe. His father, Pepin the Short, had just pulled off one of the most audacious political coups in medieval history. In 751, with the Pope's blessing, he deposed the last Merovingian king, figurehead named Childeric III, and claimed the Frankish throne for himself. This wasn't just a change of ruler, it was a revolution. It established a new precedent. A king's right to rule came not just from blood, but from divine sanction, channeled through the Church of Rome. The court into which young Charles was born wasn't a glittering palace like Versailles. The Carolingian court was fundamentally itinerant, a moving capital that traveled seasonally between royal estates scattered across the kingdom. For young Charles, childhood was a constant journey. He traveled through the dense forests and along the wide river valleys of Francia, from the Rhine frontier all the way to the Atlantic coast. This wasn't a vacation, it was his first lesson in governance. He learned that a king's authority depended on his physical presence, on showing his face to maintain control. These early travels exposed him to the incredible diversity of his father's kingdom. He saw the Romanized territories of Aquitaine in the south and the Germanic heartlands along the Rhine. Each region had its own laws, its own language, and its own culture, a patchwork of identities that would later challenge his grand imperial ambitions. The political landscape of the 8th century was a constant tug-of-war between the king's desire for central power and the fierce independence of the local nobility. The Carolingian rise hadn't eliminated the powerful aristocrats who had dominated Frankish politics for centuries. Pepin the Short's reign was a masterclass in negotiation, a constant balancing act with powerful magnates who controlled vast estates and commanded their own private armies. These old guard nobles looked at the new Carolingian dynasty with a mix of acceptance and deep suspicion. From the sidelines, young Charles watched his father navigate these treacherous political waters. He learned a crucial lesson. Royal authority wasn't just about military might. It was about personal relationships, strategic marriages, and the delicate art of persuasion. The court itself was a beehive of activity, a unique blend of government office and military headquarters. Wherever the king set up his temporary palace, the complex buzzed with energy. Scribes were constantly at work, copying royal diplomas. Messengers arrived breathless with reports from distant frontiers. Nobles waited in line seeking an audience with the king. Charles grew up surrounded by the machinery of an early medieval state. He saw the chancery producing official documents, the treasury managing the kingdom's wealth, and the royal chapel handling not just spiritual guidance, but also diplomatic correspondence with Rome and even distant Constantinople. This environment was an intensive, hands-on education in the practical mechanics of ruling. It's far more valuable than any formal classroom could ever be. Pepin the Short was a shrewd man. He recognized that for his son to succeed, he needed more than just a strong sword arm. Charles's education had to combine the traditional martial skills expected of a Frankish nobleman with the sophisticated administrative talents needed to govern a complex realm. Pepin hired some of the most learned men in 8th century Francia to tutor his son. These were clerics trained in cathedral schools, men who preserved the knowledge of classical Latin literature, Christian theology, and the basics of law. But this intellectual training never overshadowed what was most important for a Frankish leader: military skill. Frankish culture demanded that a young noble prove his courage not in practice drills, but in the heat of actual combat. Charles got his first taste of warfare tagging along on his father's campaigns against the Saxons, the Aquitanians and other tribes who dared to challenge Carolingian rule. These expeditions were his military classroom. He learned the complex logistics of medieval warfare, how to assemble an army from across the kingdom, how to maintain supply lines through hostile territory, and how to coordinate cavalry and infantry in battle. The young prince learned to read the terrain, to assess an enemy's position, to understand the psychological factors that could decide a battle before a single sword was drawn. The military education Charles received was on the cutting edge of 8th century warfare. His own grandfather, Charles Martel, the Hammer, had pioneered the use of heavy cavalry, the force that would come to dominate medieval battlefields. Pepin, the Short, continued these innovations, developing new techniques for siege warfare and expanding the kingdom's ability to project power over vast distances. Charles absorbed these tactical lessons, but he also learned the diplomatic and logistical skills needed to hold together the alliances that made these large-scale campaigns possible. The Frankish military wasn't a single unified army. It was a coalition of independent magnates, each contributing troops and resources in exchange for the king's recognition of their local power. Christianity was the bedrock of Charles's education, but this wasn't the quiet, contemplative faith of a monastery. The Christianity taught to Carolingian royalty was a militant faith. It emphasized the king's role as God's chosen representative on earth, with a sacred duty to protect the church and expand the borders of Christendom. This belief system justified war against pagan peoples, framing it as a holy mission. It also demanded that Christian rulers, like the kings of the Old Testament, maintain high moral standards. Charles learned to see himself as a warrior king, chosen by God to defend and expand the faith. The alliance with the Pope that had put his father on the throne required constant diplomatic maintenance. Charles watched his father carefully manage relationships with bishops, powerful abbots, and legates from Rome. He learned that religious authority was a double-edged sword. It could be a powerful source of legitimacy, but it could also be a major constraint on a king's power. The young prince saw firsthand how theological debates, like the dispute over the use of icons in the Byzantine Empire, could have massive political consequences, straining relations between the Frankish court and the Eastern Roman Empire. These experiences taught him that a successful king needed a sophisticated understanding of both religious doctrine and church law. Then, in 768 AD, Pepin the Short died. This triggered a succession crisis that would be the final, ultimate test of everything Charles had learned. Following Frankish tradition, the kingdom was not passed to a single heir. It was divided between Charles and his younger brother Charlemagne. This custom, the idea that a king's realm was personal property to be shared among his sons, had been the very thing that crippled the previous Merovingian dynasty, leading to centuries of civil war. Charles received the northern and western parts of the kingdom, including the Frankish heartlands of Neustria and Austrasia. Charlemagne inherited the southeastern territories, including Burgundy and parts of Aquitaine. This division immediately created huge problems. Trade routes, military alliances, and administrative systems that had been unified under their father were now split by an artificial border. Neither Charles nor Charlemagne had enough resources on their own to maintain the level of military dominance their father had enjoyed. And yet, the threats on their borders hadn't disappeared. In Italy, the Lombards were still expanding, threatening the Pope's lands and challenging Carolingian interests south of the Alps. Along the northeastern frontier, Saxon tribes launched fresh raids, testing the brothers' resolve. The kingdom was divided, the treasury was split, and enemies were at the gates. The stage was set for a conflict that would determine not only the fate of the two brothers, but the future of Europe itself. The education of Charles the Prince was over. The trial of Charles the King was about to begin. When Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, died in 768 AD, he followed tradition and divided his vast kingdom between his two sons, Charles and Charlemagne. This decision set the stage for a tense 3-year standoff that would shape the future of Europe. Charles, who would one day be known as Charlemagne, received the outer territories, a crescent of land stretching from Aquitaine in the south up through Neustria and into the Germanic lands. Charlemagne, on the other hand, was given the heartland, a more compact and perhaps more manageable territory. This division wasn't just a line on a map. It was an immediate test of each brother's resolve. Ambitious nobles, who had perhaps chafed under Pepin's strong rule, saw this split as a chance to reclaim their independence. From the very beginning, Charles had to prove that he was not a king to be trifled with. Contemporary sources, though few, paint a picture of a young king who was impossible to ignore. The royal Frankish annals describe him as exceptionally tall and physically imposing, with a commanding presence that could impress allies and intimidate enemies in equal measure. He wasn't just a warrior, though. His later biographer Einhard tells us that even as a young man, Charles was intellectually curious. He'd spend hours studying legal documents and grilling his advisors, always searching for the most effective way to govern his diverse and restless territories. While the relationship between the brothers started cordially, it quickly became strained. They were two very different men. Charles was ambitious, restless. He saw his inheritance not as a final prize, but as a starting point for something much, much bigger. His court buzzed with energy, attracting scholars, warriors, and administrators who sensed that this young king was destined for greatness. Charlemagne, in contrast, seemed more content. He focused on consolidating his power within his existing borders, preferring internal administration to external adventures. This difference in temperament created a political minefield. Frankish nobility, ever the opportunists, began to play the brothers against each other. Some saw a chance to weaken the entire Carolingian dynasty. But Charles proved to be a masterful politician. He knew when to be charismatic and generous, and when to make a calculated show of force to keep his supporters in line and his enemies guessing. The drama within the Frankish kingdom did not go unnoticed. Across the Alps in Rome, the papal court watched with bated breath. The Pope had relied heavily on Pepin's protection against the ever-present threat of the Lombards in northern Italy. Divided, and therefore weakened, Frankish kingdom was a terrifying prospect. The papacy found itself in the delicate position of trying to maintain good relations with both brothers, all while desperately hoping for the unified support their father had provided. Charles, even in these early days, seemed to understand the bigger picture. His diplomatic moves suggested he was already positioning himself as the primary Frankish authority on the international stage, the true heir to his father's legacy. Knew that to be a great king, you needed more than just a strong army. You needed information. He began experimenting with new ways to communicate across his vast kingdom, improving the royal messenger system and creating better methods for collecting reports on local conditions. These might seem like small changes, but they show a king who understood that effective rule required a rapid response to emerging problems. Of course, in the 8th century, power ultimately rested on the sword. Charles spent much of these early years preparing for war. He knew his authority depended on his ability to project force. He continued his father's military policies, encouraging innovation in warfare and maintaining the complex network of alliances needed for large-scale campaigns. But he wasn't just a distant commander. Charles personally participated in training exercises and planning sessions, reinforcing his image as a traditional Frankish warrior king. Yet, behind the warrior facade was a brilliant strategist who obsessed over logistics and supply lines, a modern approach to warfare that would become his hallmark. This delicate balance of power, this sibling rivalry that held the future of Western Europe in its hands, was about to be shattered. Charlemagne, just 20 years old, died suddenly at his villa in Samacy. The royal Frankish annals simply state that he fell ill and passed away within days. He left behind a young widow, Gerberga, and 2 infant sons, who were, by Frankish law, the rightful heirs to his kingdom. For Charles, the timing was almost unbelievably fortunate. He had spent 3 years frustrated by the constraints of shared power, watching his brother's cautiousness limit his own ambitions. Now the board was clear, and Charles's response was swift, calculated, and utterly ruthless. He had no intention of respecting tradition or his nephew's claims. He moved immediately to absorb his brother's territories before any organized opposition could form. Within weeks, Charles's most trusted agents fanned out across Charlemagne's former lands. They used a combination of personal appeals, promises of wealth and power, and thinly veiled threats to secure the loyalty of key commanders and administrators. The sheer speed of his takeover stunned everyone. Gerberga, Charlemagne's widow, knew she was in an impossible position. Her infant sons stood no chance against their uncle's battle-hardened army. In a desperate act, she fled with her children to the court of the Lombard king Desiderius, seeking protection. This single decision would have massive repercussions. It handed Charles's enemies potential puppet kings to rally around, and it dragged him directly into the tangled, treacherous world of Italian politics that had frustrated so many Frankish rulers before him. Taking over a kingdom is one thing, holding it is another. Charles knew that military occupation wasn't enough. He needed to win the hearts and minds of his new subjects. He embarked on an extensive tour of his newly acquired domains, a grand procession that served as both a show of royal power and a fact-finding mission. He met with local leaders, listened to grievances, and assessed the situation firsthand. His court scribes worked tirelessly, issuing documents that confirmed existing land grants and privileges. But with a crucial addition, every document subtly reinforced Charles's ultimate authority over all matters. The nobles who had served Charlemagne now faced a difficult choice. Many had opposed Charles's aggressive style during the period of divided rule. Now, they were at his mercy. Charles, however, showed remarkable political skill. To those who submitted quickly and pledged their loyalty, he was generous. But for those who hesitated, who showed any sign of resistance, he made terrifying examples. The message was clear. There was now only one king of the Franks, and his name was Charles. Back in Rome, Pope Stephen III watched these events with growing alarm. He had managed a cordial relationship with both brothers, but he understood that Charlemagne had been a moderating influence. The Pope now faced a single, unified Frankish king, one who was far more ambitious and unpredictable than his father. The Pope's worries proved to be well-founded. Charles soon made a diplomatic move that threatened to upend the entire political order of Italy. He decided to seek a Lombard bride. This was a shocking break from Carolingian policy. His own father, Pepin, had twice marched his army over the Alps to protect the papacy from the Lombards. The Carolingians were supposed to be the sworn protectors of the Pope, the shield against Lombard aggression. By proposing marriage to the daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, Charles was signaling a radical shift. This alliance wasn't just a personal matter. It was a political earthquake that threatened to isolate the papacy and redraw the map of Europe. The young king was no longer just consolidating his power, he was beginning to build an empire. This is the story of Charlemagne, a young king whose personal life sparked a war that would forge an empire. In 770 AD, a strategic marriage was arranged between Charles, the king of the Franks, and Desiderata, the daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius. In the high-stakes world of medieval diplomacy, these unions weren't about love, they were about power. Charles needed Lombard support for his grand ambitions, but this alliance put his role as protector of the papacy at risk. The marriage, celebrated with all the pomp of the Lombard court, lasted barely a year. In a shocking move, Charles repudiated his bride, sending her back to her father. We don't know the exact reason, but it's clear Charles decided that an alliance with the Pope was far more valuable than one with the Lombards. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a profound insult, a personal slight that King Desiderius could not ignore. The diplomatic marriage had just become a cause for war. Meanwhile in Rome, a new pope, Adrian I, ascended to the papal throne in 772. A seasoned politician, Adrian found himself walking a tightrope. He needed the Franks for protection, but Charles's unpredictable moves were making him nervous. As tensions simmered between the Franks and the Lombards, Adrian knew the entire Italian peninsula was on the brink of chaos. His letters to the Frankish court show a man trying to keep his options open, preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. The crisis exploded when King Desiderius, still furious over the insult to his daughter, decided to make a power play. He marched his army into papal territories, trying to force Pope Adrian to crown the sons of Charles's deceased brother, Charlemagne, as legitimate Frankish kings. This was a brilliant political move. It's designed to create a rival power that could challenge Charles from within his own kingdom.
Desiderius
Understood Frankish politics. But he fundamentally misunderstood one thing: the character and resolve of Charlemagne. Instead of weakening him, the Lombard threat was the perfect justification Charles needed. His ambition wasn't just for power, it was for expansion, and Desiderius had just handed him a reason to invade. Charles began preparing for his first Italian campaign, and it was here that his genius for administration and logistics truly shone. Moving a massive army across the Alps wasn't just about marching. It required incredible planning, coordinating with local officials, gathering vast amounts of supplies, and even negotiating with the Alpine communities who controlled the mountain passes. Charles was personally involved in every detail, proving that conquest required more than just bravery on the battlefield. It demanded meticulous behind-the-scenes work to keep an army fed, supplied, and effective far from home. The army Charles assembled was a testament to Carolingian military innovation. At its core was the heavy cavalry, a force revolutionized by the stirrup and improved saddles, allowing them to deliver devastating charges. They were supported by flexible infantry units and specialized engineers, equipped to lay siege to the fortified cities of Lombardy. Charles knew this wouldn't be a single battle. It would be a systematic conquest of an entire kingdom. In 773 AD, the Frankish army crossed the Alps. This was Charlemagne's first major independent campaign, a true test of his leadership. He divided his forces into two columns to navigate the treacherous mountain passes. Charles himself led the main force through the Mont Cenis Pass, while his uncle Bernard took a secondary route. This was a smart tactical move designed to stretch and confuse the Lombard defenses. King Desiderius had positioned his army to block the passes, banking on the harsh mountain terrain to wear down the Franks and force them to retreat. He believed the mountains themselves would be his greatest ally, but he underestimated his opponent's determination and the sheer efficiency of the Frankish military machine. The first clashes in the Po Valley were a brutal awakening for the Lombards. The Frankish heavy cavalry was unstoppable on the open terrain, smashing through the Lombard infantry. The psychological impact was immense. News of the Frankish victory spread like wildfire, emboldening pro-Frankish factions across northern Italy and demoralizing Lombard supporters. Throughout these early battles, Charles led from the front. He wasn't a king directing from a safe distance. He was a warrior king, sharing the dangers with his men. This inspired incredible loyalty and courage. But it also gave him a crucial advantage. He could see the battlefield with his own eyes, adapting his tactics in real time. The final act of the campaign was the siege of Pavia, the Lombard capital. This was the ultimate challenge. Pavia was a fortress, protected by massive walls, towers, and the rivers that surrounded it. It was considered nearly impregnable. Charles, ever the meticulous planner, surrounded the city, cutting off all supplies. His army built massive siege works, ramparts, towers, and engines of war designed to breach the city's defenses. The siege dragged on through the harsh winter of 773. Frankish soldiers, used to short summer campaigns, now faced the cold and the endless waiting. But their king was with them, living in a camp outside the walls, just as they were. This was unheard of for a monarch. He even sent for his wife and children to join him, signaling to everyone, his army and his enemies, that he was not leaving until Pavia fell. After a grueling 9 months, in June of 774, the city of Pavia finally surrendered. King Desiderius was captured and sent into exile. Charlemagne, in a move that would define his reign, did not just defeat the Lombards, he absorbed them. He declared himself king of the Franks and the Lombards, taking the famous Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself. The Lombard kingdom was no more. It was now part of a rapidly growing Frankish empire. This first Italian campaign was more than just a military victory. It was the moment Charles became Charlemagne. It demonstrated his strategic brilliance, his logistical mastery, and his unshakable will. From a failed marriage came a war, and from that war the foundations of a new European empire were laid. An empire that would shape the course of history for centuries to come. We're going to look at two pivotal moments that didn't just expand his kingdom, but fundamentally reshaped Europe itself. Let's start in Italy. The siege of the Lombard capital Pavia was a grueling, extended affair. It wasn't just a test of military might. It was a test of endurance and discipline. Imagine being a Frankish soldier, far from home, facing a harsh winter. Morale could have easily collapsed, but this is where we see Charlemagne's genius shine. He led by personal example, offered material incentives, and even staged strategic diversions to keep his army focused and engaged. But Charlemagne wasn't just a general. He was a master politician. While his army surrounded Pavia, he was in constant negotiation. He talked with potential military allies, but also with church leaders, city merchants, and local landowners. He knew that to hold on to Italy, he needed more than just a military victory. He needed to win the peace. He understood that true conquest wasn't just about taking land. It was about building a functioning, stable administration. In June of 774, Pavia finally fell. The Lombard king Desiderius surrendered, and was sent to a Frankish monastery. Just like that, the Lombard kingdom, which had dominated northern Italy for over 2 centuries, was gone. Charlemagne then took a bold step. He declared himself king of the Lombards. This wasn't just a new title, it was a dramatic expansion of his power, setting a precedent for a unified European authority that would echo for centuries. But ruling Italy was a whole different challenge. It's unlike his relatively uniform Frankish lands. Northern Italy was a complex patchwork of different laws, jurisdictions, and cultures, with Roman, Byzantine, and Lombard influences all mixed together. A lesser ruler might have tried to impose Frankish systems on everyone, but Charlemagne was smarter. His initial appointments showed a willingness to work with existing power structures. He understood that effective rule required compromise, not a complete overhaul. This was especially tricky when dealing with the papacy. Pope Adrian was thrilled to see the Lombards gone, but he was also wary of this powerful new Frankish neighbor. Charlemagne had to perform a delicate balancing act, asserting his authority while respecting the church's privileges and influence. Now let's turn our attention north. It's one of the most brutal and defining conflicts of Charlemagne's reign, the Saxon Wars. In 772, Charlemagne launched a direct assault on the very heart of Saxon identity. His target was the Irminsul. This wasn't just a fort or a city. It was a towering wooden pillar, a sacred religious symbol that the Saxon tribes believed was the cosmic axis holding up the entire universe. For them, the Irminsul was the center of their world. By ordering its destruction, Charlemagne wasn't just waging war. He was declaring war on their entire culture and belief system. He knew that to conquer the Saxons, he had to break them spiritually. The Saxons were a completely different kind of enemy compared to the Lombards. They had no central king, no single capital to capture. They were a collection of tribes, spread across the forests and rivers of modern-day Germany. You had the Westphalians, the Angrians, the Eastphalians, each with its own leaders and traditions. Conquering them would require a totally different and far more brutal strategy. The Frankish army marched on the fortress of Eresburg, a key strategic location that not only protected Saxon lands, but also housed the sacred grove of the Irminsul. Eresburg was well defended, with massive earthworks and wooden palisades. It was a base for Saxon raids and a vital cultural center. For Charlemagne, taking Eresburg was the first crucial step to dominating the region. The siege was a showcase of Frankish military engineering. They built siege towers, used battering rams, and even dug tunnels to undermine the walls. The Saxon defenders fought with incredible bravery, knowing that surrender meant being forced to convert to Christianity and submitting to foreign rule. They launched fiery arrows and daring night raids, doing everything they could to hold back the Frankish war machine. But eventually, after weeks of intense fighting, Eresburg fell. This was a major victory, but the real psychological blow was yet to come. Charlemagne's soldiers marched into the sacred grove. Imagine their awe and apprehension as they stood before the Irminsul. It was a massive pillar, nearly 30 feet tall, carved from a huge oak and covered in precious ornaments. On Charlemagne's orders, his men stripped the pillar of its gold and silver, and then, with axes, they chopped it down. As it crashed to the ground, Frankish priests performed Christian ceremonies, consecrating the site. The message was clear and terrifying. Your gods are powerless, your world is broken, and our God now rules here. The sheer amount of treasure they looted from the site showed just how important this place was. It was the accumulated wealth of generations. For the Saxons, this was more than a defeat. It was an apocalypse. And for Charlemagne, it was just the beginning of a long, bloody war to subjugate a people who refused to bow. These two campaigns, in Italy and Saxony, show the two faces of Charlemagne, the savvy diplomat building a new European order, and the ruthless warlord crushing all who stood in his way. Both were essential in forging the empire that would bear his name. This wasn't just a clash of armies. It was a clash of worlds, of beliefs, and it would forge the very foundations of modern Germany. Our story begins in 772 AD. Charlemagne, the ambitious king of the Franks, wasn't just content with raiding. He had a grander vision. He marched his army into the heart of Saxony with a singular symbolic target, the Irminsul. This wasn't just a tree or a pillar. To the Saxons, it was the center of their cosmos, the pillar that held up the world. Charlemagne chopped it down, plundered the sacred site, and in doing so declared war not just on the Saxon people, but on their gods. The destruction of the Irminsul was meant to be a show of overwhelming power, a demonstration of the Christian god's superiority. Charlemagne distributed the captured treasure among his warriors, a classic Germanic way to ensure loyalty. But he strategically sent the most precious items to Frankish churches and monasteries, symbolically transferring Saxon wealth and soul into Christian hands. For the Saxons, this was a cataclysm. Their priests and wise women had taught for generations that the pillar's fall would bring about the end of the world. When the sky didn't fall, a deep religious crisis took root. Some began to question their old beliefs, wondering if the Frankish god was indeed stronger. Others, however, saw it as a temporary setback, a divine test that required even more ferocious resistance to restore balance to the cosmos. This internal division was a weakness Charlemagne would expertly exploit for years to come. Recognizing that this conquest would be a marathon, not a sprint, Charlemagne made a crucial strategic shift. He established a permanent Frankish garrison at Erzberg, the former site of the Irminsul. This was a new kind of warfare for the Franks. It wasn't just a seasonal raid anymore. It was an occupation. Warriors, administrators, craftsmen, and priests moved in. Frankish engineers, using superior stone construction techniques, fortified the old Saxon earthworks. And in the ultimate act of dominance, they built a Christian chapel right where the sacred Irminsul had stood. Every stone was a reminder of the new world order Charles intended to impose. The Saxons, though decentralized, were not broken. Their political structure, a loose collection of tribes, was both a strength and a weakness. The Westphalians, who bore the brunt of the initial invasion, immediately launched retaliatory raids. But coordinating a unified large-scale resistance was difficult. Different tribes had different priorities and age-old rivalries. Into this fractured landscape stepped a figure who would become a legend, Widukind. Frankish sources paint him as a pagan obstacle, but they can't hide their grudging respect. A Westphalian nobleman with deep family connections, Widukind was more than just a warrior. He was a brilliant political operator, a leader who managed to unite rival tribes and coordinate resistance on a scale the Franks had not anticipated. He was the ghost in the forest, the symbol of Saxon defiance. The war fell into a brutal, predictable rhythm. Charlemagne would invade in the spring and summer, when the weather was good for moving large armies. The Saxons, led by Widukind, would melt away, avoiding direct battles against the superior Frankish force. They'd harass supply lines and wait. Then, as autumn approached and the Franks withdrew to their winter quarters, the Saxons would strike back, reclaiming lost ground and undoing the year's conquests. It was a frustrating, bloody cycle. Charlemagne's answer was to double down on his fortress strategy. He realized that to break this cycle, he needed to maintain year-round pressure. He began constructing a network of fortified strongholds, or *BURGS*, across Saxony. Each one was a massive investment, a permanent base of operations deep in enemy territory. Their locations were chosen with care, controlling river crossings, securing supply routes, and overlooking Saxon population centers. These weren't the simple earth and wood forts of the Saxons. The Franks brought the legacy of Roman military engineering. Their stone fortifications could withstand Saxon sieges and served as secure launch pads for their heavy cavalry, which held a distinct advantage over the Saxon infantry in open battle. These fortresses were islands of Frankish power in a hostile Saxon sea, slowly strangling the resistance. But military conquest was only half the battle. Charlemagne's ultimate goal was to transform Saxon society from the inside out. He established Christian bishoprics in the conquered lands, a long-term project of institutional and religious control. He recruited bishops and clergy from across his empire, sending brave, educated, and zealous men into what was effectively a war zone. Their mission was monumental: convert a fiercely independent people who had held on to their pagan traditions for centuries. And this is where the campaign took its darkest turn. Charlemagne's policy was one of forced conversion. For the Saxons, the choice was stark: accept Christian baptism and submit to Frankish rule, or face execution, enslavement, or exile. These brutal measures, known as the Saxon capitularies, generated enormous resentment. Many Saxons accepted baptism only to save their own lives, their conversions being only skin-deep. The moment Frankish military pressure eased, they would revert to their old ways, and the cycle of rebellion would begin anew. This pattern of submission and rebellion infuriated Charlemagne. He had expected decisive military victory to lead to lasting political control, as it had in his other campaigns. But the Saxons were different. Leaders like Witikind were masters of guerrilla warfare, submitting when faced with overwhelming force, only to rise again the moment the Frankish army turned its back. This endless war drained the resources of the Frankish kingdom and limited Charlemagne's ability to pursue other strategic goals. The breaking point came in 782 AD at the Suntel Hills. The Saxon army, led by Witikind, ambushed and completely annihilated a Frankish force. Charlemagne's frustration boiled over into pure rage. He marched his main army to Verdun, at the confluence of the Allar and Weser rivers. He demanded the Saxons hand over the leaders of the rebellion. According to the Royal Frankish Annals, they surrendered 4,500 of their countrymen. What happened next is one of the most infamous events of Charlemagne's reign: the massacre of Verdun. In a single day, he ordered the beheading of all 4,500 Saxon captives. This wasn't a battle, it was a calculated act of state terror, designed to break the Saxon will to resist once and for all. The massacre sent a shockwave of horror across Saxony, and even drew criticism from scholars within Charlemagne's own court. But it didn't work. Instead of crushing the rebellion, the massacre of Verdun fueled it with the fire of vengeance. Witikind, who had escaped, rallied the Saxons to a new, even more desperate and widespread uprising. The war would rage for another 2 decades. Charlemagne's campaign of civilization had descended into a brutal war of attrition, forever staining his legacy, but ultimately succeeding in forging a new, unified kingdom from the fires of conquest. What do you think? Was Charlemagne a visionary empire builder, or a ruthless tyrant? But we're not just talking about crowning achievements. We're going to uncover the brutal, calculating, and sometimes disastrous decisions that defined his empire. This is the story of a king, willing to do whatever it took to forge a legacy, even if it meant rivers of blood and a military catastrophe that would be immortalized in legend. Let's start with the Saxon Wars, a brutal, decades-long conflict. Imagine this. Charlemagne's army has captured roughly 4,500 Saxon rebels. What happens next is not a negotiation or imprisonment. At Verdun, on the banks of the Allar River, Frankish soldiers systematically execute every single captive in a single day. This event, now known as the Massacre of Verdun, was so brutal it shocked even hardened medieval observers. It was a terrifying display of power, a message sent in blood: defy me, and this is your fate. While the massacre did temporarily crush Saxon resistance, it had unintended consequences. The sheer scale of the killing created martyrs, fueling the very rebellion it was meant to extinguish. The act was so extreme that it caused disgust not just among Charlemagne's enemies, but within his own court. Even one of his most trusted advisors, Alcuin of York, later criticized the slaughter, revealing a growing unease with the king's increasingly savage methods. The moral lines were blurring, and even his allies were starting to question the cost of conquest. In response to this iron-fisted approach, the Saxons didn't just give up. They adapted. Instead of facing the mighty Frankish army in open battle, they melted into the forests and marshlands. Their leaders, like the famous Witikind, mastered guerrilla warfare. They conducted lightning-fast raids on isolated garrisons and supply lines, striking hard and then vanishing into the landscape they knew so well. This kept Frankish forces constantly on edge, draining their resources and morale. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, proving that conquering a land was one thing, but holding it was another entirely. It wasn't just the men fighting. The Saxon resistance was a total societal effort. While Frankish accounts focus on male warriors, evidence suggests Saxon women were the backbone of the opposition. They were crucial in maintaining secret communication networks, preserving their traditional pagan beliefs against forced conversion, and passing down the cultural knowledge that kept their identity alive. Saxon priestesses, in particular, bravely maintained their ancient religious rites, risking severe punishment to defy Charlemagne's new Christian order. This relentless war was also incredibly expensive. Unlike his campaigns in Italy, which yielded wealthy cities and rich trade routes, Saxony was mostly agricultural. There wasn't much loot to be had. The cost of maintaining permanent forts and supplying thousands of soldiers across this hostile territory was a massive drain on Charlemagne's treasury. Resources that could have been used for development or other campaigns were continuously poured into this seemingly endless Saxon quagmire. Then, in the year 778, a tantalizing and deceptive opportunity presented itself. Envoys arrived at Charlemagne's court from Muslim governors in northern Iberia, modern-day Spain. They were embroiled in a civil war against the powerful Umayyad emir of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman. In a twist of fate, these Muslim leaders were asking the most famous Christian king in Europe for help. This bizarre alliance shows just how complex 8th century politics were, where immediate power struggles often trumped religious divides. So, who was this emir they were fighting? Abd al-Rahman was a survivor. He was the last remnant of the Umayyad dynasty, which had been overthrown and almost completely wiped out in the Middle East. He had fled to Iberia and through sheer skill and grit, carved out a powerful emirate. But his efforts to centralize power angered local governors, who had grown used to their independence. One of these rebels, Suleiman ibn al-Arabi, the governor of Barcelona, was the one who reached out to Charlemagne, hoping the Frankish king would be the key to his victory. Suleiman's offer was incredibly tempting. He controlled wealthy port cities like Barcelona, a hub of Mediterranean trade. He promised Charlemagne not only riches, but also significant territory south of the Pyrenees Mountains, which would expand the Frankish kingdom into a whole new frontier. The envoys came prepared, with detailed maps, intelligence on the emir's army, and assurances that the local population would support a Frankish intervention. For a king as ambitious as Charlemagne, this was an offer too good to refuse. Charlemagne, brimming with confidence from his military successes, accepted. The decision was classic Charlemagne, a mix of ambition, military self-assurance, and a desire for both strategic advantage and material wealth. Plus, the idea of fighting in Muslim territory aligned perfectly with the militant Christian ideology of his court. It was a chance to gain land, riches, and religious glory all at once. What could possibly go wrong? The preparations for the Iberian campaign were immense. The army Charlemagne assembled in the spring of 778 was one of the largest he had ever commanded, a multinational force of Franks, Lombards, and others. The logistics were staggering. This entire grand expedition was built on a foundation of political promises from rebel allies in a land Charlemagne didn't fully understand. He was marching his massive army south, heading toward a date with destiny, and a disaster that would echo through the ages in one of history's greatest epic poems, the Song of Roland. Have you ever heard of the legendary Charlemagne, the great unifier of Western Europe? His name often conjures images of glorious victories and an expanding empire. But what if I told you about a campaign that didn't end in triumph? A story of ambition, betrayal, and a disastrous retreat that would be immortalized in legend. This is the true story of Charlemagne's ill-fated invasion of Spain in 778 AD. Our story begins not with Charlemagne, but with a plea for help. In the sprawling Muslim-controlled territory of Al-Andalus, a civil war was brewing. A coalition of disgruntled Muslim governors, led by Suleiman al-Arabi of Barcelona, saw an opportunity. They looked north to the most powerful Christian ruler of the age, Charles, King of the Franks. They promised him the great city of Zaragoza and a foothold in Iberia if he would help them overthrow the ruling emir of Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman, the first for Charlemagne. This was a golden opportunity. It was a chance to expand his Christian empire, secure his southern border, and perhaps even play the role of a great liberator. Planning such an audacious campaign was a monumental task. The Frankish army would need to cross the formidable Pyrenees Mountains, a natural fortress separating Gaul from Iberia. This wasn't just a matter of marching, it was a massive logistical puzzle. Frankish quartermasters worked tirelessly, setting up supply depots along the route and striking deals with local communities to ensure the army wouldn't starve. And what an army it was. Charlemagne knew that success in the unfamiliar Spanish terrain required a diverse and adaptable force. The core of his army was his famous heavy cavalry, clad in the best armor of the day. But he also brought infantry, including specialized siege engineers armed with the latest technology for breaking down fortified walls. In a show of political strength, He even incorporated contingents from Lombardy, a recently conquered territory, demonstrating his ability to integrate new peoples into his vast military machine. In the early summer of 778, the great Frankish host set out. Thanks to Suleiman's agents who had prepared the way and secured local guides, the crossing of the Pyrenees went surprisingly smoothly. To ease the logistical strain, the army split into multiple columns, snaking their way through the treacherous mountain passes. Charlemagne himself led the main force along an ancient Roman road, the most practical route for such a large army. As his warriors descended from the mountains, they got their first taste of Iberia. The warm, dry Mediterranean air was a world away from the cool, temperate climate of their Frankish homeland. Initially, everything went according to plan. Just as Suleiman had promised, his allied forces provided support in several smaller Muslim strongholds. Intimidated by the sheer size and reputation of the Frankish army, surrendered without a fight. Tales of Charlemagne's recent victories in Italy and Saxony had preceded him, and many local commanders chose to negotiate rather than face the wrath of the Carolingian war machine. These early victories boosted Frankish morale. Surrendering cities offered rich tributes, giving the soldiers their first taste of Iberian wealth, and reinforcing Charlemagne's belief that this expedition would be another glorious success. But then they reached Zaragoza. This is where the campaign began to unravel. The city's governor, a man named Al-Hussein, had seemed sympathetic to the rebellion, but the sight of a massive Christian army at his gates apparently gave him second thoughts. He seemed to decide that siding with Christian invaders was a far greater risk than making peace with his own emir. He slammed the city gates shut. Zaragoza was no simple fortress. Its defenses were formidable, built on ancient Roman foundations and strengthened over centuries. The city sat on the Ebro River, giving it a near-endless water supply. And its garrison was filled with experienced warriors who knew that surrender to a Christian army could mean forced conversion or enslavement. For them, this was a fight for their lives and their faith. Charlemagne was now faced with his most challenging siege since the conquest of Pavia. He set up his siege lines and brought forward his engineers. But the Franks quickly discovered that their war machines, so effective against Germanic and Lombard forts, were less so against the sophisticated defenses of Al-Andalus. Zaragoza's engineers had incorporated advanced designs from the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. They had complex gate systems, cleverly designed fields of fire, and even secret underground tunnels for launching surprise attacks on the besiegers. The city's large civilian population also pitched in, providing a deep reservoir of manpower for the defense. As the siege dragged on, the Frankish army's situation grew dire. The intense summer heat of the Ebro Valley was debilitating for soldiers used to cooler climates. Supply lines stretched thin across the Pyrenees became increasingly vulnerable. Frankish foraging parties sent to find food in the countryside were met with fierce resistance from local Muslim populations who saw them as nothing but hostile invaders. It became nearly impossible to supplement the army's dwindling official supplies. Charlemagne tried to navigate the complex web of local politics, but his efforts backfired. He had assumed that Muslim Al-Andalus was a unified entity, but he was wrong. It was a fractured landscape of competing Arab, Berber, and local Iberian factions, each with their own agendas. As a Christian king, he was an object of suspicion to all sides. Any Muslim leader who associated with him risked losing all credibility with their own people. His attempts at diplomacy only revealed how naive his initial assumptions had been. Then, devastating news arrived from back home. A Saxon chieftain, Widukind, had taken advantage of Charlemagne's absence to launch a massive rebellion in the northeast, threatening to undo years of hard-won conquests. Charlemagne was now trapped in an impossible strategic dilemma. Continuing the siege of Zaragoza offered little hope of success, but ignoring the Saxon revolt could mean losing a huge chunk of his kingdom. His advisors were unanimous. They had to abandon Spain and deal with the more immediate threat. With a heavy heart, Charlemagne made his decision. The expedition had failed. In late July 778, he ordered the retreat. But leaving was not as simple as arriving. Withdrawal was a fighting retreat through hostile territory. Muslim forces harassed their columns, and local populations, who had once been neutral or even helpful, now provided intelligence to their enemies. The logistical nightmare of moving a large, weary army through difficult terrain while under constant attack, tested the Frankish military to its absolute limits. Morale plummeted, as the soldiers realized they were abandoning a failed campaign that had cost them dearly in blood, with nothing to show for it. Charlemagne reorganized his forces for the perilous journey home. The main army would take the most direct route back over the Pyrenees, but to protect them, he needed a rearguard, a force to hold the mountain passes and shield the rest of the army from the pursuing enemy. For this crucial and incredibly dangerous task, he chose one of his most trusted commanders, a man named Roland. This is where history bleeds into legend. As Charlemagne and the main army crossed back into Francia, Roland and his rearguard held the pass of Roncesvalles. It was there that they were ambushed by local Basque forces, not the Muslim army, as later poems would claim. In the narrow defiles of the Pyrenees, the Franks' heavy cavalry was useless. Outnumbered and trapped, Roland and his men fought to the last. This heroic, tragic last stand would become the stuff of legend, immortalized in the Song of Roland, one of the greatest epic poems of the Middle Ages. The defeat at Roncesvalles Pass was a bitter postscript to an already failed campaign. Charlemagne had marched into Spain with dreams of conquest and glory. He left with a broken army, a brewing rebellion on his northern border, and the memory of his best men lost in a mountain pass. The 778 campaign was a rare and humbling failure for the great emperor. It was a stark reminder that even for the most powerful rulers, ambition has its limits, and that victory is never guaranteed. It serves as a powerful lesson from history, a story of overreach, cultural misunderstanding, and the brutal realities of war. As Charlemagne's army retreated from Spain, a substantial rear guard was tasked with protecting the baggage train from any pursuers. Command of this critical unit was given to some of his most trusted leaders, including Roland, the prefect of the Breton March. This force was a mix of elite Frankish warriors, Breton auxiliaries skilled in mountain warfare, and Gascon troops whose local knowledge was deemed essential for navigating the treacherous Pyrenea passes. In early August of 778, the Frankish army found itself stretched thin across miles of difficult mountain terrain. The main force was already descending towards Gascony, while Roland's rearguard was still climbing towards the highest point of Roncesvalles Pass. The narrow ravines and steep slopes of the Pyrenees created natural bottlenecks, making the army incredibly vulnerable to attack from the high ground. Watching this retreat with keen interest were the local Basque populations. Fiercely independent, they were masters of mountain warfare and saw an opportunity to advance their own interests. At Roncesvalles Pass, they demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of these tactics against one of the most elite armies of the era. The Basque warriors, positioned on the heights overlooking the pass, launched their assault at the perfect moment. The rearguard was completely isolated, miles away from any potential support from Charlemagne's main army. The attackers used the environment to their full advantage. They rolled boulders down the slopes to break the Frankish formations, rained down javelins and arrows from positions that were almost impossible to counterattack, and launched coordinated rushes to exploit any gaps in the Frankish line. Roland and his commanders desperately tried to maintain discipline and organize a defense. But the steep terrain and the scattered nature of the Basque attackers made a coordinated response nearly impossible. The pride of the Carolingian army, the heavy cavalry, proved almost useless in the narrow confines of the pass. The horses couldn't maneuver effectively, and their riders became easy targets for the attackers positioned above. The infantry fought bravely in the close quarters combat that ensued, but they were simply outnumbered and outmaneuvered, unable to cover all the routes the Basques used to infiltrate their positions. During the brutal fighting, Roland, one of Charlemagne's most capable commanders, was killed, while contemporary sources are sparse on the exact details. Later accounts depict him fighting with desperate courage until he was overwhelmed. The loss of such a prominent figure, along with the complete destruction of the rearguard, was a profound personal blow to Charlemagne. It went beyond a simple military loss. It damaged his relationships with the noble families whose sons had perished in the ambush. What's fascinating is how this military disaster was transformed into one of the most celebrated stories in medieval literature, the Song of Roland. This demonstrates the remarkable ability of medieval culture to turn failure into a tale of spiritual triumph. The historical reality of a Basque ambush, motivated by local politics, was spun by later poets into an epic confrontation between Christian heroes and Muslim villains. This reframing tapped into the religious conflicts that were defining medieval European identity. Roland's death, likely the result of a tactical miscalculation in difficult terrain, was reimagined as a glorious martyrdom, a perfect example of Christian knighthood and feudal loyalty. This transformation from historical fact to legendary narrative reveals the complex interplay between political need and cultural memory. Charlemagne's court had every reason to downplay a significant military defeat that cost them dearly and achieved nothing. Turning the disaster at Roncesvalles into a story of heroic sacrifice served multiple purposes. It honored the fallen, provided moral lessons on loyalty and courage that reinforced Carolingian ideology, and cleverly deflected attention from the strategic blunders that led to the catastrophe in the first place. The substitution of Muslim enemies for the actual Basque attackers reflected both the prejudices of the time and the political usefulness of framing the defeat as part of the wider struggle against Islamic expansion. With the Saxon crisis finally resolved in 785 AD, Charlemagne was free to turn his attention to his southeastern frontier. Here, the Duchy of Bavaria, under the rule of Tassilo III, had evolved into a quasi-independent state, challenging the very foundation of Carolingian authority. The relationship between the Franks and Bavaria had been deteriorating for years. Tassilo skillfully used his duchy's strategic position, wedged between the Frankish heartlands and the Byzantine sphere of influence, to pursue his own policies. Tensions had been further stoked by Tassilo's marriage to Liutperga, the daughter of the former Lombard king Desiderius, whom Charlemagne had defeated. Charles saw this alliance as a deliberate move to build an anti-Frankish coalition that could threaten the stability of his entire eastern frontier. Tassilo himself represented the last embers of the old Germanic tradition of autonomous ducal power, a system that the Carolingians had worked so hard to dismantle. His family had governed Bavaria for nearly a century, establishing deep roots within the duchy's religious and secular institutions. Bavaria itself was a significant power, its territory stretching from the Danube Valley down into the Alps, encompassing what is now Austria, and wielding influence over the Slavic peoples to the east. This prime location gave Bavaria control over lucrative trade routes, generating revenue that allowed Tassilo to maintain a military and administration that rivaled those of many independent kingdoms. A theological dispute in the 780s gave Charlemagne the perfect pretext to intervene. Tassilo's support for the adoptionist heresy, a theological debate about the nature of Christ's divine sonship, allowed Charlemagne to frame his actions as a defense of Orthodox Christianity rather than a simple power grab. By doing so, he could challenge Bavarian autonomy without appearing to violate traditional Frankish laws concerning ducal authority, masterfully blending religious piety with political ambition to bring Bavaria firmly under his control. Have you ever wondered what happens when a massive, ancient empire, famed for its mountains of treasure, suddenly faces one of the greatest military minds in history? This is the story of Charlemagne's epic war against the Avar Khaganate, a conflict that would reshape Europe and unearth a legendary fortune. The Frankish armies that gathered for the Avar campaigns were unlike any seen before. This wasn't just a Frankish force. It was a truly international coalition, a testament to Charlemagne's expanding power. Bavarian troops, newly part of the Frankish military, brought crucial knowledge of the local terrain and Avar tactics. Lombard units from Italy contributed advanced siege equipment and engineering skills honed over centuries. Even Saxon auxiliaries from recently conquered lands joined the fray. Their participation, a political statement of their integration into the Carolingian world. This wasn't just an army. It was the Carolingian war machine in all its diverse glory. As the Franks advanced into Avar territory in 791 AD, they didn't find the pitched battles they were used to. The Avars were clever. They refused direct confrontation, opting instead for hit-and-run attacks on supply lines and isolated detachments. They systematically destroyed resources, aiming to starve the massive Frankish army out. Strategy showed a deep understanding of Carolingian weaknesses, particularly the logistical nightmare of supplying a large force so far from home. The Avars weren't just fighting a war, they were waging economic warfare. The heart of the Avar defense was the legendary ring, a series of massive circular fortifications. This wasn't a single castle, but multiple barriers of earth and wood stretching for dozens of miles. Each was designed to funnel attackers into deadly kill zones where Avar archers could rain down arrows. To breach these defenses, Frankish engineers had to get creative. Drawing on experience from past sieges, they developed new techniques. Instead of attacking one point, they launched coordinated assaults on multiple sections at once, preventing the Avar defenders from concentrating their forces. This clever tactic allowed them to break through the successive barriers much more quickly. Finally, in 795 AD, the Franks breached the innermost ring. What they found inside exceeded their wildest dreams. The treasure hoards of the Avars, accumulated over 2 centuries of raiding and demanding tribute, were simply staggering. Gold and silver objects from all over the known world, Byzantine coins, Lombard jewelry, Saxon metalwork, and exotic items that spoke of trade routes stretching to Constantinople and Baghdad. Frankish chroniclers couldn't even quantify the wealth. One source claims it took 15 wagons, each pulled by 4 oxen, just to haul it all away. It was likely the largest single accumulation of treasure in medieval Europe. So, what do you do with a treasure that can fund an entire empire? Charlemagne was a master politician as much as a general. He didn't just hoard the wealth. A portion went to his personal treasury, of course, but the rest was systematically distributed. His loyal nobles, clergy, and military commanders all received substantial shares, a calculated move to reward their service and ensure their future support. Huge amounts of gold and silver were also donated to churches and monasteries across the realm. This served a religious purpose, but also a practical one. These secure locations acted as the kingdom's banks, storing wealth that could be accessed in future emergencies. With the Avars defeated and their treasure secured, Charlemagne faced a new challenge: how to hold this new territory. His solution was the creation of the Ostmark, or Eastern March. This was a permanent administrative unit, a fortified frontier designed to govern the conquered lands and defend against future threats from the east. Extending from the Enns River eastward, this new province would later form the core of Austria. To lead it, Charlemagne appointed Count Gerald, a man who combined military skill with diplomatic savvy, the perfect choice for a tough job on a dangerous frontier. To secure the Ostmark for good, the Carolingians launched ambitious colonization policies. Frankish settlers drawn from overpopulated areas of the kingdom were offered land grants and tax breaks to move to the new frontier. They brought with them advanced farming techniques, transforming lands once used for pastoralism into productive agricultural regions. This not only created a loyal population that could serve as a local militia, but also generated the economic growth needed to fund the administration and defense of the march. Alongside settlement came Christianization. New bishoprics were established at key locations, creating institutional centers for both religious conversion and secular governance. Missionaries worked to convert the remaining Avar populations and the numerous Slavic communities that had lived under Avar rule. For these Slavic groups, converting to Christianity and accepting Carolingian authority offered a path to improved status and integration into the new political order. Integrating the diverse Slavic communities was a complex task. Many had maintained their own social structures and traditions for centuries. Instead of imposing Frankish systems directly, Charlemagne's administrators often opted for a policy of indirect rule. Local Slavic chiefs were allowed to maintain their authority in exchange for acknowledging Charlemagne as their overlord and accepting Christianity. This flexible approach allowed different cultures to coexist within the broader framework of the Carolingian Empire. The strategic importance of the Ostmark soon became crystal clear. Reports began to filter into the Carolingian court about a new people moving west across the steppes: the Magyars. These fierce nomadic warriors represented a potential threat that could make the Avars look tame by comparison. Charlemagne's foresight in fortifying the Ostmark, establishing permanent military installations, and creating a trained local population proved essential. The Eastern March was no longer just a conquered territory. It was a vital buffer zone, the first line of defense for the entire Carolingian realm against the storms gathering in the east. The Avar Wars were more than just a military victory. They were a masterclass in imperial expansion, administration, and foresight. Charlemagne didn't just conquer a people. He took their wealth, integrated their lands, and built a lasting frontier that would shape the map of Europe for centuries to come. For Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, the journey began not on a battlefield, but with a brutal street assault on a pope. This is the story of how a violent conspiracy in Rome transformed a king into the first emperor in Western Europe since the fall of the Roman Empire. Our story kicks off in Rome on April 25th, 799 AD. Pope Leo III is leading a sacred procession through the city streets. Suddenly, chaos erupts. A mob, led by relatives of the previous pope, attacks. They aren't just angry, they're driven by a deep-seated resentment. They see Leo as an upstart, a man of low birth who has no right to hold the highest office in the church. Their goal is horrific: to blind the pope and cut out his tongue, rendering him incapable of ever serving again. They drag Leo from his horse, and in front of a horrified crowd, they attempt their grisly work. Miraculously, loyal supporters manage to intervene before the mutilations are complete, but Leo is left gravely injured. The conspirators, believing they've succeeded, declare him deposed and try to install their own man. The church is on the brink of a schism, a total breakdown of authority. But Pope Leo is a survivor. Aided by loyalists, he makes a dramatic escape from the city. Wounded and desperate, he embarks on a perilous journey north, over the Alps, to seek help from the most powerful man in Europe, Charles, King of the Franks. When the fugitive pope arrives at Charlemagne's court in Paderborn, it's an unprecedented moment in history. Never before has a pope fled to a foreign ruler for protection. It's a tacit admission that the papacy, for all its spiritual power, is vulnerable and needs a secular sword to defend it. Charlemagne sees the gravity of the situation, but he also sees the incredible opportunity. He isn't just a brute warrior, it's a brilliant political strategist. He receives Leo with all the honors due to a reigning pope, immediately signaling to the world that he, Charlemagne, is the true defender of the church. This single act legitimizes any future action he might take in Rome. Charlemagne launches a full-scale investigation. The pope's enemies present a laundry list of charges: adultery, perjury, corruption. Were they true? It's hard to say. The cutthroat world of Roman politics, accusations were weapons. The truth became secondary to the power struggle. Charlemagne realized he couldn't just sit back. He had to go to Rome himself. This was a massive gamble. If he succeeded, he would be the ultimate arbiter of power in Christendom. If he failed, he could shatter the fragile balance between church and state forever. In the autumn of the year 800, Charlemagne prepares for his journey. This is no simple trip. He assembles a powerful entourage, elite troops to project strength, legal scholars to navigate the thorny issues of canon law, and diplomats to manage the political fallout. As his army crosses the Alps, it's a clear message to all factions in Rome: the king is coming, and he means business. The composition of his army is a masterstroke of diplomacy, including troops from his Italian territories, to show he is a legitimate ruler there, not just a foreign invader. When Charlemagne finally enters Rome in November, he does so with carefully planned ceremony. He isn't a conqueror, he is a protector. The people of Rome, exhausted by months of chaos, welcome him as a savior. The stage is set for a grand assembly, a synod, to be held at St. Peter's Basilica. Charlemagne summons bishops and nobles from across his vast kingdom. He knows that for any decision to stick, it needs broad support. Everyone with a stake in the outcome is present, but make no mistake, Charlemagne is in control. The synod faces a unique problem. How do you judge a pope? There was no precedent. The idea that the pope could be judged by anyone, a concept we now take for granted, was unfirmly established yet. Charlemagne's legal experts had to get creative, piecing together a process from various legal traditions. The tension in St. Peter's must have been immense. The fate of the papacy, and indeed the future of Europe, hung in the balance. Then comes the climactic moment. On December 23rd, 800, just 2 days before Christmas, Pope Leo III stands before the assembly. Instead of undergoing a trial, he performs an oath of purgation. He places his hand on the Gospels and swears that he is innocent of all the charges brought against him. By doing this, he isn't submitting to the judgment of the court, but to the judgment of God alone. It's a brilliant move that restores his authority without diminishing the dignity of his office. The crisis is resolved. Charlemagne's gamble has paid off spectacularly. 2 days later, on Christmas Day, Charlemagne attends Mass in St. Peter's Basilica. As the great king kneels in prayer, Pope Leo III approaches him holding a golden crown. In a move that would echo through the centuries, Leo places the crown on Charlemagne's head, and the people of Rome cry out. The most pious Augustus, crowned by God the Great and peace-giving emperor, long life and victory, in that single moment, everything changed. Charles the King was now Charles the Emperor. The Western Roman Empire, which had vanished over 300 years earlier, was reborn. This coronation was more than just a title. It formalized the powerful alliance between the papacy and the Frankish ruler. It created a new political and religious order for Europe. The concept of a Holy Roman Empire, where the emperor's sword would protect the pope's cross, this powerful idea would shape the continent for the next 1,000 years. It all started with a desperate, bleeding pope, a savvy and ambitious king, a single history-making Christmas day in Rome. What an incredible story, right? It just shows how personal crises can have world-changing consequences. Picture this: Rome, the year 800. Pope Leo III stands before a grand assembly in St. Peter's Basilica. Serious accusations hang over his head, threatening his very position. But instead of a lengthy trial, something extraordinary happens. Drawing on ancient traditions, Leo swears a solemn oath, calling upon God himself to judge his innocence. If he lies, he says, may divine judgment strike him down. The assembled bishops and nobles, faced with this powerful act of faith, accept his word. The crisis is averted. This moment not only saved Leo's papacy, but also reinforced the immense spiritual power of his office. It set the stage for an event that would reshape the Western world. Just a few weeks later, on Christmas Day, that same St. Peter's Basilica is overflowing. Pilgrims and nobles from across Europe have flocked to the city, drawn by the recent drama. Among them is the most powerful man in Europe, Charles, King of the Franks. The very man whose support helped Pope Leo keep his position. As Charles kneels in prayer, something completely unexpected happens. Pope Leo approaches, holding a magnificent golden crown. In one swift historic motion, he places it on the king's head, and a cry goes up from the congregation. A ritual acclamation echoing the days of the ancient Caesars to Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans. In an instant, Charles the King became Charlemagne, the first Western Roman emperor in over 300 years. But was this a surprise? Was it a spontaneous gesture of gratitude from the Pope? Or was it a brilliantly calculated political move, planned in secret? The historical accounts are fuzzy. Charlemagne's own biographer Einhard later wrote that the new emperor was furious, claiming he wouldn't have even entered the church that day if he'd known what was coming. Was this genuine shock? Or was it a clever bit of political theater to make it seem like he wasn't indebted to the Pope for his new title? We can only speculate. What is certain is that the Frankish nobles present roared their approval, recognizing that their king had just ascended to a whole new level of power. But this grand celebration in Rome sent shockwaves all the way to Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire. For centuries, the Byzantines had seen themselves as the one and only true continuation of the Roman legacy. Now, this Frankish barbarian was claiming the same title. The ruler in Constantinople at the time was Empress Irene, a formidable figure who had seized power from her own son. The last thing she needed was a rival emperor in the West, challenging her legitimacy. And so began the two emperors' problem. This wasn't just about a title. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews. Byzantine theory was clear. Imperial authority came directly from God, passed down an unbroken line from the first Christian emperor, Constantine. In their eyes, Charlemagne was a usurper, plain and simple. His coronation by the Pope meant nothing. But Charlemagne's supporters had a different take. They argued that imperial authority could be transferred, especially by the Pope, and particularly if the existing ruler in the East was deemed unfit, like an empress who had brutally deposed her own son. This cold war of legitimacy played out in the letters and documents of the time. Byzantine diplomats stubbornly referred to Charlemagne only as king, refusing to use his imperial title. Meanwhile, Carolingian scribes adopted all the grand protocols of an imperial court, subtly erasing the Byzantines' claim to universal rule. This wasn't just a war of words. It had real-world consequences. The rivalry ignited military conflicts, particularly in southern Italy, where the two empires' territories rubbed up against each other. Each side launched raids and sponsored rebellions, trying to prove through military might whose imperial authority was more effective. The conflict even spilled over into the church. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople, already at odds over religious doctrines and practices, found their disagreements amplified. Issues like the use of icons in worship and differing theological clauses became weapons in a larger political and imperial struggle. This single act on Christmas Day, the crowning of an emperor, had not just revived an ancient title. It had drawn new battle lines, political, military, and spiritual, that would define the map and the very soul of Europe for centuries to come. The world had changed forever, and the echo of that moment in St. Peter's Basilica can still be felt today. Have you ever wondered how one man could transform a collection of warring tribes into a unified, sophisticated empire? We often think of Charlemagne as a mighty warrior, as a father of Europe, but his greatest victories weren't just won on the battlefield. They were won in the halls of power, in bustling markets, and most importantly, in the classroom. This is the story of how Charlemagne built an empire, not just with swords, but with ideas. When Charlemagne was crowned emperor in 800 AD, it wasn't just a fancy new title. It was a direct challenge to the other great power of the time, the Byzantine Empire in the East. This rivalry kicked off an economic Cold War. The Byzantines tried to squeeze Carolingian merchants out of the lucrative Eastern markets, disrupting the flow of spices and luxury goods that had connected Europe for centuries. But this didn't stop Charlemagne. Instead, it forced his people to get creative, forging new trade routes and demonstrating that his new empire could bring prosperity to its subjects. Ruling an empire was a whole different ballgame than ruling a kingdom. Charlemagne's court had to level up. His administrators started using grand imperial language in official documents. Court ceremonies became more elaborate, blending ancient Roman traditions with Germanic customs. This wasn't just for show. It was a practical necessity to govern a vast and diverse population. Projecting the dignity and authority everyone expected from an emperor, while still holding on to the administrative practices that had made his kingdom strong in the first place. But Charlemagne's masterstroke was realizing that true imperial power needed more than just a strong army and a good bureaucracy. It needed a powerful intellect.
Also,
He embarked on one of the most ambitious educational projects in history. He decided to turn his court, which had mostly been a mobile military camp, into Europe's leading center for learning. Around 782 AD, he founded the legendary palace school at Aachen. His goal was to create an institution that could rival the great intellectual centers of Constantinople and Baghdad, and to produce the skilled administrators his growing empire desperately needed. The school's location right within the palace complex showed just how serious Charlemagne was. He wasn't just a patron of learning, he was an active participant. Imagine the emperor himself, fresh from a military campaign, sitting in on lectures and debating theology alongside young nobles and seasoned clerics. He was building an empire of the mind, and he was leading from the front. To lead this intellectual revolution, Charlemagne needed the best of the best. In 782, he made a brilliant hire, Alcuin of York. Alcuin was one of the most respected scholars of his time, a master of grammar, rhetoric, and theology. He came from England, bringing with him the rich intellectual heritage preserved in its monasteries since the days of the Venerable Bede. His arrival was a turning point. Charlemagne knew that to run an empire, he needed people who could read Latin fluently, write diplomatic letters, and navigate complex legal issues. Alcuin had the system, the experience, and the knowledge to make that happen. Alcuin wasn't alone. Charlemagne assembled a true dream team of scholars from all across Europe. There was Paul the Deacon, a Lombard historian who bridged the gap between classical literature and Germanic traditions. There was the young Frankish noble Einhard, who would go on to write the first great medieval biography of Charlemagne. Using literary techniques he learned right there at the school, this diversity was intentional. Charlemagne understood that excellence comes from bringing together different perspectives, not from sticking to a single way of thinking. The faculty was incredibly diverse. Theodulf of Orleans, a scholar from Spain, brought insights shaped by Christian communities living under Muslim rule. He was familiar with both Latin and Arabic intellectual traditions, offering the court a unique window into the Islamic world. Then there was the Irish scholar Dungill, whose knowledge of mathematics and astronomy was far ahead of his time. He introduced advanced computational methods that helped solve practical problems. like reforming the calendar and planning the massive architectural projects that were turning Aachen into a capital worthy of an empire. So what did they actually learn at this remarkable school? The curriculum, designed by Alcuin, was both systematic and practical. The foundation was the trivium: grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic. Grammar wasn't just about rules. Students studied classical authors like Virgil and Cicero. This gave them models of great writing and also taught them about Roman history and political theory, which directly influenced Carolingian ideas about what an empire should be. Rhetoric gave them the skills for debate and diplomacy, while dialectic sharpened their logical reasoning for tackling complex theological questions. Beyond the language arts was the quadrivium: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. These weren't just abstract subjects. Arithmetic was crucial for managing imperial finances and organizing military supplies. Geometry was the foundation for the ambitious building projects and enhanced their military engineering. Music was vital for church services and also played a key role in diplomatic ceremonies, adding to the splendor of the imperial court. It was a holistic education designed to produce well-rounded leaders. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the palace school is something you might use every day without even realizing it: lowercase letters. The scholars at Aachen, led by Alcuin, developed a revolutionary new script called Carolingian minuscule. Before this, writing styles varied wildly across Europe, making manuscripts difficult to read. This new script was clear, consistent, and easy to read. It was a standardized system that allowed scholars from Spain to Germany to read the same text without difficulty. It was so effective that it became the foundation for virtually all later European scripts, and it's the direct ancestor of the lowercase letters we use today. So when we think of Charlemagne, let's remember not just the warrior who conquered lands, but the visionary who built an empire of knowledge. He understood that to unite a continent, you needed more than just force. You needed a shared culture, a common language of administration, and a commitment to learning. The intellectual fire he lit at the palace school in Aachen would illuminate Europe for centuries to come. It's a legacy written not in stone, but in the very letters we read and write today. He wasn't just a conqueror. He was a visionary who pulled Europe out of a dark age and sparked a cultural rebirth we now call the Carolingian Renaissance. But how did he do it? It wasn't just with armies. It was with ideas, innovation, and some seriously clever branding. Imagine trying to run a massive empire where every region writes differently. It's chaos, right? Letters from one place would be completely unreadable in another. Charlemagne's scholars, led by the brilliant Alcuin of York, tackled this head-on. Their solution was a game-changer: Carolingian minuscule. This wasn't just a new font. It was a revolution in communication. With its uniform letter heights, standardized spacing between words. Yes, they invented that. And a system of punctuation, it made texts clear, legible, and easy to read for anyone trained in the system. Suddenly, a book copied in Germany could be perfectly understood by a scholar in France. This standardization wasn't just about neat handwriting. It was about creating a shared intellectual network, the internet of the 9th century, allowing knowledge to spread like never before. This new script fueled a massive project, preserving knowledge. Charlemagne knew that building an empire required more than just laws. It needed a solid foundation of history, theology, and classical wisdom. He established scriptoria, basically manuscript factories, where teams of skilled scribes worked to produce accurate copies of essential texts. This was a systematic, state-sponsored effort to rescue the great works of Rome and the early church from being lost to time. They understood that a single copying error could corrupt a text for generations, so they treated accuracy with the same reverence as beautiful penmanship. This wasn't just about making books. It was about safeguarding the entire intellectual heritage of Western civilization. But Charlemagne's ambition wasn't just confined to books. He wanted his capital, Aachen, to be a new Rome, a city that would visually declare the power and permanence of his empire. The crown jewel of this project was the magnificent Palatine Chapel. This wasn't just another church. It was an architectural marvel, the most ambitious building project in Northern Europe for centuries. Inspired by the stunning San Vitale in Ravenna, Italy, its octagonal design and soaring dome were engineered to rival the great buildings of Rome and Constantinople. It was a bold statement that the heart of power and culture had moved north. Building such a masterpiece was a monumental task. The local builders in Charlemagne's lands simply didn't have the know-how for a project this complex. So what did they do? They crowdsourced expertise from across the known world. Master builders from Italy, where Roman techniques had survived, were brought in for their stone cutting and dome construction skills. Craftsmen from the Byzantine Empire contributed their dazzling mosaic techniques. This fusion of Roman engineering, Byzantine artistry, and Carolingian vision created a completely new style of architecture. The Palatine Chapel wasn't just a copy of older styles. It was a unique synthesis that would influence European cathedrals for centuries to come. Walking into the Palatine Chapel was meant to be an awe-inspiring experience, a carefully crafted piece of political theater. The interior was covered in breathtaking mosaics designed to send a clear message. A famous mosaic showed Christ in majesty, surrounded by symbols of the evangelists. For the literate courtier and the illiterate visitor alike, the image was unmistakable. Divine authority was endorsing Charlemagne's rule. This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda in its most beautiful form. Using art to connect earthly power with heavenly approval and legitimize the entire Carolingian project. Charlemagne's building spree didn't stop with the chapel. The entire palace complex at Aachen was designed to function as a worthy imperial capital. There was a great hall, built with timber framing techniques that followed classical proportions, large enough to host grand ceremonies and diplomatic receptions. And Charlemagne, a man who appreciated the finer things in life, even brought back a classic Roman luxury, the thermal baths. They harnessed natural hot springs and used sophisticated engineering for heating and water distribution. This wasn't just about comfort, it was a demonstration of technical mastery, proving they could replicate the engineering feats of the ancient Romans. The palace's infrastructure was incredibly advanced for its time. They built aqueducts and drainage networks to ensure a clean, reliable water supply for the entire community, not just for the royal family, but for all the servants, craftsmen, and officials who made the palace run. This focus on practical engineering, on sanitation and public works, shows a level of civic planning that had been largely absent in Europe for centuries. It was another way Charlemagne was quite literally rebuilding civilization from the ground up. Of course, an empire needs more than just grand buildings. It needs laws. Charlemagne's empire was a patchwork of different peoples, each with their own customs and legal traditions. To unify them, he initiated a massive legal codification project. He regularly issued capitularies, which were legal decrees, addressing everything from church discipline and trade regulations to military service. These documents show a deep understanding that true authority comes from a legal framework that is both respected by the people and practical for administrators to enforce. One of the most important of these was the Admonitio Generalis of 789. This was a comprehensive blueprint for reform across the empire. It set standards for the church, the economy, and the military. But most critically, it mandated the establishment of schools at cathedrals and monasteries. This wasn't just about creating a few educated elites. It was about building the institutional foundation for a widespread intellectual revival. This legal act is one of the key reasons we can even talk about a Carolingian Renaissance. It was lawmaking as culture building. And for a glimpse into the day-to-day management of the empire, we have the incredible Capitulaire de Villiers, issued around the year 800. This document is a detailed instruction manual for managing the royal estates. It covers everything from what crops to plant and how to care for livestock to the specific duties of estate managers. It's a fascinating look into the medieval economy, showing a commitment to efficient, productive, and sustainable agriculture. This level of micromanagement ensured the economic engine of the empire was always running smoothly, providing the resources needed for all of Charlemagne's other ambitious projects. So, when we look back at Charlemagne, we see more than a warrior king. We see a systems builder. He understood that a powerful empire rested on interconnected pillars, a universal script for communication, a program to preserve knowledge, monumental architecture to project power, and a unified legal code to ensure order. By engineering this brilliant system, Charlemagne didn't just rule an empire, he laid the very foundations for the future of Europe. Have you ever wondered how one person could rule an empire stretching from Spain to Germany in the 8th century without emails, phones, or even a decent road system? This is the story of Charlemagne, a king who became an emperor, and the incredible innovations he used to manage a realm of dizzying complexity. Charlemagne's transformation from king to emperor wasn't just a title change. It was a complete administrative revolution. His empire was vast, covering territories with different languages, laws, and loyalties. How could he possibly keep it all together? His secret weapon was an institution he perfected, the asterisk, Missi Dominici asterisk, or envoys of the Lord. These weren't just any messengers. The asterisk Missi asterisk traveled in pairs, one church official, like a bishop, and one secular noble. They were Charlemagne's eyes and ears across his domain. Their job was to ensure his laws were followed, his taxes were collected, and his justice was served, even in the most remote corners of the empire. They were a direct link between the local village and the imperial court, a human communication network that held the fragile empire together. To guide them, the asterisk, Missi asterisk, received detailed written instructions, called asterisk, capitula asterisk. These weren't vague suggestions. They were comprehensive checklists covering everything from investigating corrupt officials to checking if churches had proper educational programs. Imagine receiving a scroll that's part legal code, part HR manual, and part performance review for an entire region. This systematic approach shows Charlemagne's genius. He understood that to rule effectively, he needed consistent standards applied everywhere. The empire was divided into circuits, or asterisk, Miss Attica, asterisk, each designed to be inspected by a pair of asterisk, Missi asterisk, over several months. The layout of these circuits was brilliant, taking into account geography, travel routes, and local politics. The mountainous alpine regions required a different strategy than the populated river valleys of Francia. And in newly conquered territories like Saxony, the asterisk, Missi asterisk, had to be extra vigilant, watching for any signs of rebellion. Who were these powerful envoys? Charlemagne chose them carefully. They had to be unquestionably loyal, proven administrators, and possess the social status to command respect. A powerful bishop paired with a high-ranking count could walk into any local court and expect to be heard. This blend of official authority and personal prestige was crucial in an era where power was deeply personal. But their job was anything but easy. The challenges they faced were immense. In Saxony, a asterisk, Mrs. asterisk, might have to determine if a recent Christian convert was sincere or just pretending to avoid trouble. In the Slavic lands, they had to navigate complex local power structures that clashed with Frankish law. Their reports, some of which survive today, give us a fascinating ground-level view of the daily struggles of running an empire. They documented everything from broken bridges to local feuds, showing the constant effort required to maintain order. Charlemagne's vision extended deep into the daily lives of his subjects, even to what they grew and how they worked. His capitularies, or royal decrees, were incredibly detailed, covering everything from crop rotation and livestock management to market regulations. This wasn't micromanagement for its own sake. It was a systematic effort to boost efficiency and productivity across the empire. He was applying principles of good management, inspired by Roman traditions, to the practical problems of a growing medieval economy. Just as he sought to unify his empire politically, Charlemagne was determined to unify it religiously. He knew that a shared faith was a powerful glue. But how do you standardize belief across dozens of different cultures? His solution was ambitious: standardize worship itself. He ordered a massive project to revise liturgical books, creating authoritative editions that were distributed to churches and monasteries everywhere. This created an unprecedented uniformity in Christian services, replacing regional variations that had sometimes led to confusing and even heretical theological disputes. By adopting Roman liturgical traditions as the imperial standard, Charlemagne was sending a clear message: religious unity would be built on a common institutional framework, not just local customs. This religious reform wasn't just about books and prayers. It was about people. Charlemagne established new bishoprics in conquered lands, creating administrative centers that served both religious and secular purposes. And he demanded that all clergy be competent in Latin. This ensured they could read the standardized texts and participate in the imperial administration, linking the local priests directly to the emperor's grand project. Charlemagne's ambition for order also revolutionized the law. His empire was a patchwork of legal traditions: Frankish law, Roman law, and the local customs of conquered peoples like the Saxons and Lombards. He didn't try to erase them all and impose one single code. Instead, he created a hybrid system. He compiled existing laws, selectively adopted Roman legal principles, and accommodated local customs where possible. This created a legal framework that was both uniform and flexible. Imperial authority was absolute on fundamental issues, but there was room for local variation. Of course, this complex system required experts to interpret and apply it. So, Charlemagne promoted the creation of schools that could provide both the theoretical knowledge and the practical training needed to produce a class of skilled legal administrators. Finally, none of this would have been possible without a stable economy. Charlemagne understood the critical link between money, trade, and political power. Around the year 794, he launched a major monetary reform. He established a new standard for silver coinage, the denarius asterisk. This small silver coin, stamped with his imperial title and Christian symbols, became the standard currency for the entire empire. This wasn't just about making trade easier. It created a unified economic zone, facilitated tax collection, and gave the emperor control over the money supply. This single, reliable currency laid the foundation for commercial growth and influenced European coinage for centuries to come. From his traveling envoys to his standardized coins, Charlemagne's reign was a masterclass in administration. He built an empire not just with swords, but with systems, laws, and a unifying vision. He took the fragmented world he inherited and, through sheer force of will and administrative genius, forged a new European order. It's not just about winning battles. It's about the nitty-gritty details, the unseen systems that hold everything together. Today, we're diving deep into the genius of Charlemagne, a ruler who understood that, to control an empire, you have to control everything from the money in your pocket to the prayers in your church. Let's start with something you probably don't think about: weights and measures. In the early medieval world, buying and selling goods was a nightmare. A pound of grain in one town could be completely different from a pound in the next. It was chaotic. Charlemagne saw this mess and said, "No more." He established standard weights and measures across his entire Carolingian empire. This wasn't just about making trade easier, it was a power move. He was showing everyone from the smallest merchant to the most powerful lord that his authority reached into every corner of their lives. Imperial officials were put in charge of making sure everyone played by the new rules, bringing order to the economic chaos. But you can't have a strong economy without a strong foundation. And in the Middle Ages, that foundation was agriculture. Charlemagne was obsessed with efficient farming. He created a detailed guide, known as the Capula de Villiers asterisk, for managing the massive royal estates scattered across his lands. These weren't just farms, they were engines of the imperial economy. They generated revenue for the government, acted as models for the latest farming techniques like crop rotation, and provided jobs for local communities. The level of detail in these regulations shows a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of agricultural science. Charlemagne was applying Roman-style administrative precision to the fields and farms of his empire. With goods flowing and farms producing, you need a place to sell them. Charlemagne didn't just let markets pop up wherever they pleased. He created designated market towns, each with specific days and rules for trading. This created a controlled environment where his officials could keep an eye on things, collect taxes, and ensure stability. These market privileges became incredibly valuable. Towns would compete fiercely, paying huge fees to the emperor for the right to host a market, knowing it would bring them immense prosperity. It was a brilliant system that encouraged economic growth while filling the imperial treasury and maintaining control. Of course, all this trade is much easier with a stable currency. Before Charlemagne, it was a free-for-all. Local lords and powerful figures minted their own coins, creating a confusing and unreliable mess. Charlemagne put a stop to it, prohibited private minting, and established a single unified imperial currency. Every legal coin now bore his image and symbols, a constant reminder of who was in charge. He even required certain taxes and fines to be paid in his silver coins, not just through barter. This forced people to use the official currency, which gave his administrators a much clearer picture of the economic activity happening across the vast empire. But Charlemagne's vision for a unified empire wasn't just about money and markets. He believed that true unity required spiritual unity. The problem was, religious practices varied wildly from region to region. So, he gathered the brightest scholars of his time at his palace school and gave them a monumental task: create standardized versions of all essential religious texts. These revised Bibles and prayer books were then distributed to churches and monasteries everywhere, creating a common religious foundation for all his subjects. It was an ambitious project to unify the very soul of his empire. Creating standard books was one thing, but ensuring the clergy could actually read and understand them was another challenge entirely. Many priests at the time were poorly educated. Charlemagne recognized that effective religious leadership needed a solid intellectual foundation. So, he issued a revolutionary decree. All priests had to demonstrate basic competence in Latin, the language of the Church, and have a solid grasp of Christian doctrine. This was a massive undertaking. To meet this new standard, cathedral schools were established and monastic education programs were expanded across the empire. It was one of the most systematic attempts at intellectual reform in the early medieval period, a true educational revolution. Uniformity also extended to the sound of worship itself. Liturgical practices, including the chants and music used in church services, had developed differently everywhere. Charlemagne, strengthening his alliance with the Pope in Rome, declared the Roman tradition as the imperial standard. This meant adopting a specific style of music we now know as Gregorian chant. But you can't just hand a monk a sheet of music they've never seen before. This required a massive training effort. Specialized instructors had to be recruited and new educational programs developed just to teach the clergy how to perform this complex, beautiful music, ensuring that a church service in Aachen would sound just like one in Rome. Monasteries were powerful institutions in the Carolingian world. They were not just spiritual centers, but also major landowners and economic players. Charlemagne knew he needed to regulate them. He enforced the rule of Saint Benedict as the standard for all monastic life. This created unprecedented uniformity in how monks lived, prayed, and worked. Imperial inspectors would regularly visit to ensure these standards were being met. He also regulated their vast economic resources, making sure these powerful institutions managed their lands and wealth efficiently, supporting not just their own needs but the broader goals of the empire. As Charlemagne grew older, he faced the ultimate challenge for any empire builder. What happens after you're gone? Frankish tradition dictated that a father's lands be divided among his sons, a practice that could shatter his unified empire. In 806 AD, he drafted a document called the Divisio, Regnorum or the Division of the Kingdoms. It was a masterful attempt to balance Frankish inheritance customs with the need for imperial unity. He carefully planned to divide the empire among his 3 sons, but with built-in mechanisms for them to coordinate on military and diplomatic issues, preserving a sense of a united Carolingian world. The plan was incredibly strategic. Charlemagne didn't just draw random lines on a map. He considered the geography, economy, and military realities of each region. His eldest son, Charles the Younger, was to receive the Frankish heartlands of Neustria and Burgundy, a powerful and stable core. His second son, Pepin, was given the Kingdom of Italy along with strategic territories like Bavaria, controlling wealthy cities and vital alpine passes. The youngest, Louis, received Aquitaine and the Spanish March, a frontier zone that required constant military readiness, but also offered opportunities for glory and expansion. It was a sophisticated plan to create viable, balanced kingdoms for his heirs. Sadly, this intricate plan was never fully realized. 2 of Charlemagne's sons, Pepin and Charles, died before him. When Charlemagne himself passed away in 814, his only surviving legitimate son, Louis the Pious, inherited the entire undivided empire. The challenge of succession, the one problem Charlemagne had tried so meticulously to solve, was simply postponed. But the systems he built, the standardized economy, the reformed church, the emphasis on education, created a legacy that would shape the course of European history for centuries to come. His reign proves that the true strength of an empire lies not just in its armies, but in the brilliant, often invisible structures that bind it together. Charlemagne, ever the pragmatist, knew that an empire built by one man could easily shatter after his death. His solution was a document called the Divisio Regnorum, or the division of the kingdoms. The plan was to split the empire among his three legitimate sons, Charles the Younger, Pepin of Italy, and Louis. It was a classic Frankish approach to inheritance, but with a twist. The document laid out rules for cooperation, dispute resolution, and even coordinated military action. Charlemagne hoped to maintain a unified Carolingian identity, even if the empire was politically fragmented. He especially emphasized religious unity, knowing the church was the strongest glue, holding his diverse lands together. But as is so often the case in history, fate had other plans. A succession crisis brewed, but not the one Charlemagne had anticipated. Tragedy struck the imperial family. Pepin of Italy died in 810, followed by the promising Charles the Younger in 811. Suddenly, a carefully crafted plan for a shared inheritance was obsolete. Only one son remained, Louis. This unforeseen turn of events created an opportunity for reunification that Charlemagne hadn't planned for. Recognizing the new reality, in 813, he crowned Louis as emperor. This ceremony, deliberately conducted without the Pope's involvement, was a powerful statement. Charlemagne was asserting that imperial authority, including the right to choose a successor, flowed from the emperor himself, not from Rome. It was a move to secure a stable and legitimate transition of power. In his final years, Charlemagne seemed increasingly aware that his personal charisma and force of will were enough to sustain the empire long term. He needed to build institutions that could outlive him. This led to a wave of administrative innovations. He pushed for the systematic codification of laws and procedures, established permanent record-keeping systems. Novelty for the era, and even created training programs for imperial officials. These weren't just tweaks, they were revolutionary attempts to institutionalize governance. In an age where personal relationships were everything, Charlemagne was trying to create a system that could function effectively no matter who was in charge. This was the fundamental challenge of early medieval state building, and Charlemagne was tackling it head-on. Of course, running an empire of this scale required an unprecedented amount of money. The financial administration had to be incredibly sophisticated. Imagine trying to collect taxes and allocate resources across territories with different economies, languages, and customs, all while facing constant external threats. Imperial officials had to perform complex calculations, assessing local economic conditions and military needs, all while navigating the delicate political sensitivities of each region. To manage this, Charlemagne's government developed standardized accounting procedures and trained a new class of financial administrators. These innovations in governmental practice were groundbreaking and would influence the development of European states for centuries to come. The military also underwent significant reforms. It wasn't just about defending the empire's newly expanded frontiers, it was about building a professional fighting force that could last. The system of military obligation was standardized, ensuring a more reliable way to raise armies and distributing the burden of service more equitably. Furthermore, Charlemagne established permanent garrisons in vulnerable frontier regions. These weren't just defensive outposts. They became institutional centers for military training, where soldiers could develop the specialized skills needed to counter different types of threats. From Viking raids to skirmishes in the Spanish March, but Charlemagne's late reign also had a much darker side. After nearly 30 years of intermittent and frustrating conflict, he was determined to end the Saxon rebellion once and for all. The final phase of the Saxon Wars was characterized by a level of systematic brutality that was shocking even for the time. His goal was to crush any possibility of future resistance. Beginning around 804, he unleashed a terrifying new policy: mass deportations. This went beyond punishing specific acts of rebellion. The aim was to completely restructure Saxon society by physically uprooting entire populations from their ancestral lands, breaking the very foundations of their identity. The scale of this operation is staggering. Contemporary Frankish chroniclers record that around 10,000 Saxon families were forcibly relocated from their homes along the Elbe River. They were scattered across the Carolingian heartlands, deliberately placed in settlements where they would be surrounded by Christian Franks and kept under constant supervision. The logistics behind this revealed the terrifying efficiency of the Carolingian state. Imperial officials conducted detailed censuses of Saxon households, handpicking families. They favored younger families with children who could be more easily assimilated into Frankish Christian culture. Older Saxons who clung to their traditional beliefs faced a much harsher fate, including enslavement or even execution. Transporting tens of thousands of people, along with their livestock and possessions, across hundreds of miles was a monumental undertaking. It required extensive coordination between the military, who provided security, and civilian administrators, who managed the long, slow-moving columns of deportees. Supply depots were established along the routes, and Frankish quartermasters had to negotiate with local communities for temporary shelter and food. These columns, stretching for miles, were vulnerable, and Saxon raiders often tried to rescue their kinsmen, leading to bloody skirmishes along the way. The distribution of the Saxon families was not random. It was a carefully planned strategy of cultural erasure. Imperial administrators scattered them in small groups across various counties, ensuring they were always outnumbered by the local Frankish population. This prevented them from forming new communities that could preserve their culture or organize resistance. They were given just enough land to survive, but their dependence on Frankish neighbors for markets and services forced them to integrate. The cultural impact was devastating. Removing people from their ancestral lands severed their connection to the sacred groves, burial grounds, and natural landmarks that were central to their religious and social lives for centuries. Frankish clergy went even further, systematically destroying these Saxon religious sites. Priests accompanied the deportation columns, providing forced Christian instruction and identifying anyone who still clung to their pagan beliefs for special supervision. With the Saxon threat finally neutralized, Charlemagne's attention turned to his new northern frontier. The establishment of the Danish March was a direct response to this new strategic reality, a buffer zone against the formidable Vikings, whose raids would come to define the next chapter of European history. Charlemagne's final years show us a ruler grappling with the immense challenge of legacy. Through shrewd diplomacy, brutal force, and brilliant administration, he fought to ensure his creation would endure. He died in 814, leaving behind a unified empire for his sole surviving son, Louis. But the question remained: could any one man, even one as pious as Louis, hold together the vast and complex world that Charlemagne had built? The cracks were already beginning to show, and the story of the Carolingian decline is a lesson for the ages. The Danish king Godfred was watching the Carolingian expansion with growing alarm. He'd seen the systematic destruction of Saxon independence and was rightly concerned about what that meant for his own people. With Frankish control now stretching across the entire southern shore of the Baltic Sea, Danish trade routes and security were under unprecedented pressure. King Godfred wasn't one to sit idly by. His response was the Danevirke, a massive system of earthwork fortifications stretching across the base of the Jutland Peninsula. This incredible feat of engineering showed not only Danish determination to resist, but also their sophisticated understanding of the very military. Techniques the Franks themselves used so effectively was a clear message. This far and no further. Charlemagne understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just another border, it was a potential flashpoint. He appointed competent margraves to govern the Danish frontier, choosing men who were not just seasoned soldiers, but also skilled diplomats. Why? Because the Danes possessed something the landlocked Franks didn't: a powerful navy. Their ships could threaten Carolingian coastal territories and disrupt vital trade networks at will. These margraves had a complex job. They had to defend the border, yes, but they also had to manage the constant flow of Danish merchants, diplomats, and even refugees crossing into the empire. It was a delicate balancing act between defense and diplomacy. To support the margraves, Charlemagne established a series of fortified positions at strategic points along the frontier. These weren't just simple forts. They were secure bases for Carolingian patrols and crucial centers for gathering intelligence on Danish military preparations and political developments. Building these fortifications, however, presented a unique challenge. The marshy, waterlogged terrain of the border region made traditional stone construction nearly impossible. Frankish engineers had to innovate. They developed impressive earthwork and timber fortifications that were both effective for defense and stable in the swampy soil. These fortress systems even incorporated sophisticated drainage networks. This not only prevented flooding, but also cleverly created obstacles, channeling any attacking forces into predetermined killing zones where Carolingian defenders could inflict maximum casualties, was a brilliant adaptation of engineering to the unique challenges of the northern frontier. This heavily fortified border wasn't just a military line. It was also becoming an economic hub. The Danish March opened up new opportunities for trade and settlement, and the revenues generated helped to pay for its own administration and defense. The region's access to Baltic trade networks was a goldmine for Carolingian merchants. It could acquire valuable northern products like amber and furs, which fetched high prices in southern markets. In return, Danish traders were eager to get their hands on Frankish manufactured goods, wine, and luxury items to show off their wealth and status. To manage this burgeoning trade, designated trading centers were set up at key locations. This allowed imperial officials to monitor commercial activities and, more importantly, collect customs duties, making the March financially self-sufficient. A smart move that turned a potential vulnerability into a source of strength. But just as the empire seemed to be solidifying its borders, a crisis struck at its very heart. In December 811 AD, Charlemagne's son, Charles the Younger, died. This was a devastating blow. According to the succession plan, the asterisk divisio, Regnorum asterisk, Charles was set to inherit the western parts of the empire. His death, apparently from an illness while campaigning against Slavic tribes, wasn't just a personal tragedy for his father. It was a political catastrophe. The carefully laid plans for imperial continuity were thrown into chaos, threatening to unleash a power struggle among competing claimants. The speed at which the news traveled from the frontier to the imperial court at Aachen is a testament to the empire's efficient communication network. Mounted messengers galloped across hundreds of miles, carrying the devastating information in just a matter of days. This wasn't the first succession scare. Just a year earlier, in July 810, another of Charlemagne's sons, Pepin of Italy, had also died. This had already complicated the succession, as Pepin's young son, Bernard, had a claim to the Italian kingdom, potentially conflicting with the planned division of the empire. Now, with Charles the Younger also gone, the entire imperial inheritance was set to fall into the hands of Charlemagne's only remaining legitimate son, Louis, later known as Louis the Pious. This presented both an opportunity to maintain imperial unity and a major challenge to traditional Frankish inheritance customs, which usually required a king's lands to be divided among his sons. Charlemagne, recognizing that an empire required different rules than a traditional kingdom, made a bold decision. He proceeded with Louis's coronation as Emperor. The implications of this decision were enormous. It went far beyond just who would rule next. It touched on the fundamental nature of imperial authority itself. The empire Louis was set to inherit was a world away from the collection of Frankish territories his father had received. Decades of conquest and administrative reform had created a complex political entity with a unique cultural identity that transcended any single region. The great challenge for the future emperor would be to maintain the delicate balance between imperial unity and regional autonomy that Charlemagne had so masterfully managed. He would have to govern a vast, diverse territory while also tackling the new problems that would inevitably arise as the empire matured. While grappling with this internal crisis, Charlemagne also achieved a major diplomatic victory. In 812 AD, the Treaty of Aachen was signed with representatives from the Byzantine Empire. This treaty was the culmination of over a decade of difficult negotiations to resolve the two emperors problem that had plagued relations since Charlemagne's coronation in 800. The agreement was a masterpiece of political pragmatism. The Byzantines finally recognized Charlemagne's imperial title. In return, the Carolingians acknowledged Byzantine sovereignty over southern Italy and Sicily. This practical solution ended the intermittent warfare that had been simmering in the Mediterranean. The treaty's language was carefully crafted, avoiding grand theoretical statements about who was the true Roman emperor, and instead focusing on practical arrangements that both sides could live with. Negotiating this treaty was no easy task. It required incredible diplomatic skill to navigate the complex theological, legal, and political issues that had divided the two Christian empires for a century. The Carolingian delegation was a mix of secular officials with deep experience in international diplomacy and high-ranking churchmen who could address the religious aspects of imperial authority. The Byzantine envoys were equally skilled, bringing with them a deep knowledge of Eastern political traditions and legal precedents that had to be accommodated. The final territorial agreement simply reflected the military reality on the ground in southern Italy. Neither empire had the resources to achieve a decisive victory. The treaty acknowledged Byzantine naval power by giving them control of Calabria and Sicily, while recognizing the superiority of the Frankish land army by leaving them in control of most of the mainland. By establishing clear boundaries, the Treaty of Aachen eliminated the ambiguities that had fueled conflict and created a framework for peaceful, commercial, and diplomatic relationships that would benefit both empires for years to come. The resolution of these external and internal challenges marked the final stabilizing chapter of Charlemagne's long and transformative reign. An empire was secured, a succession was planned, and peace was made with its greatest rival. But would this carefully constructed order last without its architect? The political rivalry between the Carolingian and Byzantine empires had been a long and complex affair. It disrupted established trade networks and, in the chaos of competing jurisdictions, created a perfect storm for pirates and other criminals to thrive. But a breakthrough was on the horizon: the Treaty of Aachen. This landmark agreement established clear procedures for resolving disputes between merchants from both empires. More than that, it created a framework for joint anti-piracy operations, forcing the once rival Carolingian and Byzantine navies to cooperate. The restoration of normal commercial ties brought immediate economic benefits to both sides, creating powerful groups who now had a vested interest in maintaining peace. But the treaty didn't just solve political problems. It also addressed some of the religious tensions between Eastern and Western Christianity. While it wisely avoided direct confrontation on the most heated theological debates, like the Filioque controversy, it found practical solutions. For instance, in southern Italy, a region claimed by both Rome and Constantinople, the treaty laid out arrangements for pastoral care and administrative oversight that respected both claims. This careful silence on doctrine, while focusing on practical governance, showed incredible diplomatic savvy. The negotiators recognized that theological disputes required a different kind of dialogue than arguments over land and power. The Treaty of Aachen was more than just a single agreement. It set a precedent for international relations that would echo through European politics for centuries. It proved that even the most deeply rooted political conflicts could be resolved through systematic negotiation, as long as both sides recognized the high cost of continued war and were flexible enough to find common ground. The treaty's success in creating stable boundaries and practical cooperation mechanisms became a model for future diplomatic efforts across medieval Europe. As the empire settled into this new era of stability, the personal toll of decades of continuous warfare and rule became increasingly apparent in Charlemagne himself. Contemporary sources describe an emperor whose once legendary physical vigor had noticeably declined since his coronation. The relentless travel schedule of his younger years, where he personally led campaigns and toured his territories, gave way to longer stays at his palace in Aachen. From there, he managed the empire's affairs from the comfort and security of his grand complex. This growing reliance on written reports instead of personal observation wasn't just a sign of his physical limits. It also highlighted the sophistication of the administrative machine he had built, an empire that could now be governed effectively through institutions, not just by the personal force of its leader. During these final years, Charlemagne poured his energy into architectural projects, wanting to create lasting monuments that would preserve his memory and serve future emperors. The completion of the Palatine Chapel in Aachen was the crowning achievement, the culmination of over 2 decades of work that transformed a modest royal estate into a worthy imperial capital. The chapel's sophisticated design and magnificent decoration showcased the artistic and technical brilliance of the Carolingian Renaissance, providing a truly inspiring setting for the religious ceremonies that legitimized imperial authority. Meanwhile, the cultural and educational programs that flourished under his patronage continued to bear fruit. The graduates of the palace school went on to fill important positions in cathedral chapters, monastic communities, and secular administration. They formed a network of educated officials who shared a common intellectual foundation and cultural values, a glue that helped hold the diverse empire together. The systematic copying and distribution of classical and Christian texts had created libraries across the empire, preserving essential knowledge and providing the resources for continued intellectual growth. The legal and administrative innovations forged through decades of hands-on experience also created a framework that would outlast Charlemagne himself. The capitulary system had established a precedent for systematic lawmaking, while the missi dominci, his royal inspectors, had proven how effective regular oversight was in maintaining authority across vast distances. The standardization of weights, measures, and currency not only boosted commerce, but also provided reliable sources of government revenue. These weren't just temporary fixes. They were the building blocks of a modern state. And we can't forget the military. The reforms that had given Carolingian forces their edge had created a professional army that would influence European warfare for centuries. The powerful combination of heavy cavalry, infantry, and siege equipment had proven effective against a wide range of enemies, from Saxon warriors to professional Byzantine soldiers. His systematic approach to building fortifications created defensive networks that secured conquered territories against counterattack. Furthermore, the development of advanced logistical systems allowed the empire to project power far beyond its traditional borders, sustaining long campaigns in distant lands. By 812, the empire had reached an unprecedented size and stability. Yet it faced challenges that would test the very foundations Charlemagne had built. The physical demands of ruling lands stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube had taken their toll. Now, in his mid-60s, Charles moved with increasing difficulty and relied more heavily on his advisors for the detailed administrative work he once handled himself. His famous appetite, which had sustained him through countless campaigns, began to fade as he suffered from recurring fevers and ailments that confined him to Aachen for longer and longer periods. The harsh winter of 813 to 814 proved especially difficult for his declining health. The damp cold, which seeped even into the well-heated chambers of his palace, aggravated the respiratory problems that had plagued him for years. Einhard, his loyal biographer, gives us a detailed account from first-hand observation. He describes an emperor who, even when too weak to stand, continued to conduct the essential business of the state from his bed. He dictated letters and received reports from across his vast domains, all while struggling with a physical weakness that made even the smallest tasks exhausting. His sheer determination to fulfill his duties despite his obvious suffering deeply impressed the courtiers who were used to his seemingly inexhaustible energy. The final illness began in January 814. Contemporary sources describe a sharp pain in his side, accompanied by a high fever that left him delirious. The palace physicians, using the limited medical knowledge of the 9th century, tried everything bloodletting, herbal remedies, and constant prayers. But their efforts were no match for what modern analysis suggests was a severe case of pneumonia. After a lifetime of conquest, creation, and consolidation, the great Emperor Charlemagne's journey was coming to an end. In the twilight of his life, the great Emperor Charlemagne, a man who had forged an empire with steel and will, found himself embattled by an enemy no army could defeat. Old age, complicated by other ailments, his condition worsened rapidly. In those final days, he drifted between moments of clear-headedness, where he could recognize his loved ones and issue simple commands, and periods of fevered delirium that sent waves of alarm through his court. The palace, a place so often filled with the vibrant energy of Charlemagne's rule, now buzzed with a different kind of activity. Officials, their hearts heavy with genuine grief, meticulously enacted the sophisticated protocols for an emperor's passing. They were balancing personal sorrow with the immense practical challenge of ensuring the government wouldn't falter. In one of his last lucid moments, Charlemagne received the final rites from Archbishop Hildebold of Cologne. He also dictated his will, ensuring his personal treasures would be distributed among churches, monasteries, and the loyal retainers who had served him so faithfully. On the morning of January 28, 814, just after dawn, the end came. Surrounded by his closest advisors and family, who had kept a constant vigil through the long night, Charlemagne passed away peacefully. The immediate reaction to his death was a powerful testament to his legacy. It wasn't just grief. It was a demonstration of the robust administrative system he had built. News of the emperor's death spread with astonishing speed through the messenger networks he had established, reaching the farthest frontiers within weeks, even against the harshness of a European winter. Across the vast empire, local officials organized memorial services. These gatherings were a unique blend of Christian prayers for the emperor's soul and secular ceremonies honoring his monumental achievements. Crucially, they also included affirmations of loyalty to his successor, his son, Louis the Pious. The most telling sign of Charlemagne's success was the silence that followed his death. There were no major rebellions, no power grabs, no political chaos. The institutional frameworks he had so carefully constructed held firm, and the succession of Louis was accepted as the natural and legitimate order of things. The ship of state, built by a master, sailed on without its captain. The funeral arrangements for Charlemagne were as unique as his reign, a perfect synthesis of Christian faith and imperial tradition. Drawing on both ancient Roman customs for honoring emperors and Germanic traditions for commemorating great war chiefs, the court prepared to lay their leader to rest. His body, dressed in full imperial regalia and surrounded by the symbols of his power and conquests, lay in state within his beloved Palatine chapel at Aachen. For days, a steady stream of subjects, from local peasants to regional nobles, came to pay their last respects. The funeral procession itself was a living portrait of his empire. Bishops and abbots marched, carrying holy relics. Secular nobles followed, bearing the emblems of their office. Military commanders were there, representing the armies that had secured the empire's borders. It was a solemn parade of the very institutions Charlemagne had nurtured. He was interred within the Palatine Chapel, the political and spiritual heart of his world. Placed in a marble sarcophagus he had commissioned himself, the location was symbolic. He would forever remain at the center of the world he had created. The simplicity of the burial, however, spoke to his deep Christian faith, a recognition that all earthly glory is fleeting compared to the promise of the afterlife. The tomb's inscription, written in elegant Latin, celebrated both his imperial triumphs and his devout faith, a final message to posterity about how he wished to be remembered. The transition of power to Louis the Pious was remarkably smooth, a testament to his father's foresight. Charlemagne had crowned Louis as conqueror the previous year and had given him decades of administrative experience ruling the sub-kingdom of Aquitaine. The new emperor immediately showed he was his father's son, demonstrating continuity while also recognizing new challenges on the horizon. Louis kept most of Charlemagne's key advisors, preserving their invaluable experience, but also promoted younger officials with fresh perspectives. This created a perfect balance of institutional memory and innovation, ensuring stability during this critical period. For the moment, the vast territory Charlemagne had conquered remained intact, but subtle cracks were already beginning to appear. On the Danish frontier, the successors of King Godfred continued to test the Carolingian defenses, probing for weakness. These new military commanders lacked Charlemagne's personal, almost mythical, reputation for invincibility. In the Slavic territories to the east, which had been held in check by a mix of military threat and diplomacy, local leaders began to stir. They were watching, calculating, wondering if the new emperor possessed his father's iron will to maintain authority by force if necessary. The empire was holding, but the pressure was building. One of the strongest pillars supporting the new emperor was the church, bishops and abbots across the empire, who had flourished under Charlemagne's generous patronage and religious reforms, knew their own interests were tied to political stability. Charlemagne's systematic approach to religious education and the standardization of liturgy had created a powerful, unified institution that transcended the personality of any single ruler. The church became a critical stabilizing force, and the monasteries, which had received imperial protection and funding, became centers of unwavering loyalty to the Carolingian dynasty. These monastic communities also served as guardians of the intellectual and cultural flowering known as the Carolingian Renaissance, perhaps Charlemagne's most enduring legacy. The economic engine that Charlemagne built also continued to run, providing Louis with the resources needed to maintain imperial authority. The standardized currency system generated reliable income through minting fees and customs duties, fueling commerce across the empire. The systematic management of royal estates provided revenue and served as a model for improving agricultural productivity everywhere. And the vast trade networks connecting the empire to the Byzantine, Islamic, and Northern European worlds had developed a momentum of their own. They continued to function, generating wealth and knitting the diverse regions of the empire together, regardless of the change in leadership. Almost immediately after his death, The transformation of Charles the Man into Charlemagne the Legend began. Chroniclers and poets across Europe started crafting a new narrative, one that amplified his most glorious achievements and conveniently glossed over his failures and miscalculations. This wasn't just born of admiration, it was a political necessity. Charlemagne's successors benefited enormously from being associated with an idealized, near-mythical founder. This legend legitimized their own rule and inspired loyalty. The historical Charles, who had struggled with the day-to-day problems of governance and sometimes made costly mistakes, gradually faded. In his place rose a legendary figure, a paragon of wisdom, courage, and Christian piety, the model for all medieval kings to come. This process was cemented by one of the most famous biographies of the Middle Ages, Einhardt's Life of Charles the Great. Einhard, a close courtier of Charlemagne, modeled his work on the ancient Roman biographer Suetonius, but brilliantly adapted it for a Christian audience. He presented Charlemagne as the ideal Christian ruler, a man whose personal virtues and political successes were proof of God's favor. The book masterfully blended factual history with moral instruction, creating a template for how history would be written for centuries. It wasn't just a story of what a great ruler did. It was a lesson in what a great ruler should be. And so, the legacy of Charlemagne was secured, not just in the borders he drew or the institutions he built, but in the powerful idea of what a united Christian Europe could be. His story became a foundational myth for a continent, a guiding star for future generations of leaders, and a legend that continues to captivate us to this day. Have you ever wondered how history gets written? Who decides what we remember? The story began with monks. The monastic chronicles, like the Royal Frankish Annals, became the first drafts of his history. Compiled in monasteries across the empire, these year-by-year accounts weren't just about religious events. They were detailed records of political moves, military campaigns, and administrative changes. These monks, often with access to official documents and eyewitnesses, preserved the nuts and bolts of how the Carolingian Empire actually worked. Without their meticulous records, our understanding of this crucial period would be full of gaps. They gave us the raw data, the essential facts that allowed later historians to piece together the machinery of Charlemagne's government. But history isn't just a list of facts. It's also about the stories we tell. And Charlemagne's story was too good not to become a legend. His military campaigns, even the defeats, were transformed into epic poems. The most famous of these is the Song of Roland. It takes a real historical event, an ambush at Roncesvalles Pass, turns it into a legendary tale of heroic sacrifice. In the real ambush, Charlemagne's rearguard was attacked by the local Basque people. But in the poem, the attackers become a vast Muslim army. This change tells us a lot about the medieval mindset. It reframed a tactical defeat as part of a grander cosmic struggle between Christianity and Islam, a theme that resonated deeply with later audiences. This process shows how historical memory is shaped by cultural values, as real events are molded to fit the ideals of Christian knighthood and feudal loyalty. Beyond the battlefield and the legends, Charlemagne's most lasting impact might have been in the classroom. His push for educational reform created an intellectual shockwave that rippled through Europe for centuries. The palace school at Aachen wasn't just for show. It created a systematic approach to classical education, producing generations of scholars. These weren't just bookworms copying old texts. They preserved ancient knowledge, yes, but they also developed new ideas in theology, law, and even science, pushing medieval thought forward. A key innovation was the standardization of writing. The clear, simple script known as Carolingian, minuscule, made books easier to read and copy. This created a common written language for scholars across the continent, forming the bedrock of an international intellectual community that would define medieval Europe. Charlemagne also fundamentally changed the law, ruling over a vast and diverse empire. Franks, Lombards, Saxons, and more acquired a new legal toolkit. He didn't just impose one set of laws on everyone. Instead, he developed a system of capitularies, decrees that could address broad principles as well as specific local problems. His legal framework was a brilliant synthesis, blending Roman legal concepts, Germanic tribal traditions, and Christian canon law. This created a flexible yet unified system that could accommodate different cultures. To make it all work, he trained a new class of legal experts who could interpret and apply these complex codes. This professionalization of law laid the groundwork for the great medieval universities and the birth of law as a formal academic discipline. His legal innovations would influence European governance for centuries to come. So what happened after Charlemagne was gone? Did his empire just vanish? Not exactly. While his vast territory was soon divided among his heirs, the ideas and institutions he built endured. The very concept of a unified Christian empire, with Charlemagne as its model, became the ideological foundation for the Holy Roman Empire, a major political force in Central Europe for nearly 1,000 years. His alliance with the Pope set the stage for the complex, often tense, relationship between kings and the Church that would define medieval politics. The administrative models he developed to govern his diverse lands were copied, adapted, and refined by rulers all over Europe. He provided a blueprint for how to govern, and future kings were eager students. One of the most defining features of the Middle Ages was feudalism, and its roots run deep into Charlemagne's reign. How do you rule a massive territory without modern communication? You delegate. Charlemagne granted land to loyal nobles in exchange for their military service and administrative support. This created a web of personal, contractual relationships between the ruler and his vassals. This system of feudal bonds became the primary social and political structure of medieval Europe. It provided a framework for local governance and military organization. When centralized power weakened, this flexible system, integrating military, social, and administrative functions, allowed European society to maintain order and continuity through centuries of change. It was a practical solution to a massive problem, and it shaped a millennium of history. Perhaps Charlemagne's greatest legacy was an idea, the idea of Europe. For a brief shining moment, his empire demonstrated that the diverse peoples of the continent could be united under a single, effective government, transcending the tribal divisions that had plagued the post-Roman world. He showed that it was possible to have unity without erasing diversity, allowing different cultures and traditions to coexist within one political framework. This dream of a united Europe, inspired by his example, would echo through the centuries, influencing countless later attempts to create peace and cooperation on the continent. The Carolingian synthesis of Roman administration, Germanic law, and Christian values created a shared cultural foundation, a budding sense of a common European identity that continues to evolve even today. When Charlemagne died in 814, it wasn't just the end of a life, it was the end of an era. His empire, stretching from Spain to Germany, was the most successful attempt to reunite the West since the fall of Rome. And though political unity would crumble, his legacy was set in stone. The institutional innovations, the cultural revival, the very concept of a renewed Western Empire, these things became the permanent foundations of European civilization. The legend of Charlemagne, the great warrior, the wise administrator, the pious Christian king, would inspire rulers for 1,000 years. In death, as in life, he remained a colossal figure, a man whose vision and achievements earned him the title he still holds today, the Father of Europe. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the figures who shaped our world. See you next time.